The girl threw the plate on the ground in anger. She screamed that she would not eat. The maid froze in place as the girl almost hit her with the saucer. The girl screamed that she would not eat such a thing and told the maids to give her some sweets. She screamed with fury. The maids were shocked. From her scream, they covered their ears because the scream was unbearable. The maid screamed as the girl bit her unexpectedly. They shouted at her to move away and called her a witch. The maid sighed heavily as she found it unbearable to listen to all this. A moment later, they threw her a loaf of bread like a dog. The girl looked at the bread with a smile as she was glad of it. A moment later, she grabbed the bread and looked at him with a smile. The maid froze in shock. They looked intently at the girl, who was greedily eating the bread. The maid said that it seemed like she was going to be sick now, and she could no longer stay in such a place. The maid was shocked because the girl gave off a disgusting smell. The maids ran towards the exit with lightning speed, as they could not stay near the girl. They were in shock and did not understand how long they had to look after her. They knew that she could not be killed because of the curse. The girl plopped down on the bed with lightning speed and sighed heavily. She was very puzzled and already fed up with all this. The Holy Empire of Trump is a theocratic state in which people chosen by the gods were periodically born. The people chosen by the gods are those who were sent by the High Ones as proof of the promise given to the first emperor, who was loved by the gods for his deep devotion. They are born with divine patterns located on their bodies, and together with his revealing, they go to the temple. After this, they pray for the peace of the empire in the temple and make a sacrifice, and as payment, they receive a guarantee of wealth and honor in everyday life. The gods rejoice at the sacrifice of the man they have chosen, and thanks to this, no country dared even envy the powerful sacred empire. This was 20 years ago, but at some point the rains stopped pouring. The rivers and lakes dried up. The crop failure began. The animals disappeared. The beautiful empire in one moment sank into chaos. They said it was the fault of the despicable nomad, the bringer of misfortune, because she spent the night with the emperor and had even dirtier thoughts. Because of the archbishop's words, the inhabitants of the empire became angry. As expected, the emperor began to complain about the nomad he ordered to find and execute her. So one night, in the light of the moon, the nomad ran without memory. She pressed the baby to her weakened body, running away again and again. Although she was eventually brought to the scaffold anyway, the man screamed in rage that the child must be killed because it contained mixed dirty blood. It was then that the nomad uttered a curse. She said that this curse would haunt them even after death. She cried out that if the blood of her innocent child were to sprinkle the earth, the sacred empire would be humiliated. She said that the drought would overtake them with disease, and everyone present would die. As a result, the mother's desperate curse saved the child, and her father, the emperor, locked his own flesh and blood in a damp attic. Following the temple's instructions, a lock was placed to seal the cursed blood. But even after this, the drought continued, and the man chosen by the gods did not appear. The Trump Empire was no longer rich. After all, the chosen one of God, whom they are so diligently looking for, is locked in the attic. She looked at the bread because she didn't think she would be able to eat more than one. She didn't know how old he was. A moment later, the young lady called Aqua. Aqua looked at her mistress and asked if she had called her. The lady looked at Aqua and said that she needed to wet her throat. She asked Aqua to help her. Aqua said that of course she would help, and if it was her order, she would create as much water as she wanted. During this time, she had received many things thanks to Aqua. Many times, she had watched that terrible scene she had waited for, the moment when the empire would be driven into a dead end. Aqua flew closer to the lady, and a moment later, she already had water in her palms. The lady thanked Aqua with a smile. The empire's drought had become terrifying. Very soon, they would be ready to do anything just to find a source of water. In a situation like this, she, the princess, would be the most useful sacrifice. All this time, she diligently pretended to be abnormal. She knew they would probably think she was something they could easily use, and she knew that this particular drought would be a precious current for her. The young lady was sleeping in her tiny cell when suddenly a nightmare came over her. People screamed with rage and said that the witch had to be killed in order to appease the wrath of the gods. The man angrily struck the woman with a whip, and a moment later she fell to the ground. The lady stood at a distance and watched what was happening, while people shouted that the woman should be killed. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she watched everything that was happening. She stared at her mother while she was on the chopping block, and at the same time, everyone was shouting, demanding that she be executed quickly. A moment later, the lady heard her name called her mother, saying that she was a beautiful and unfortunate favorite child. Osiris froze in shock as she saw her mother's head on the ground. Osiris woke up and burst into tears, as she had a dream that she was beginning to forget. To protect her baby, her mother undoubtedly took all the sins upon herself. She spent her last desperate moment in the mad jubilation of the entire empire before her eyes. Even after watching this scene an infinite number of times, it seemed sad and unbearable to her, again and again. The emperor's advisors told him that he needed to make a decision urgently, as their empire had not seen a drop of rain for 3 years. They said the population had been reduced by a quarter, and they needed to take control of the water source by any means necessary. The emperor wondered in confusion whether the prayer he had recited last time in the temple had been useless. The man asked the emperor if he was thinking about sending the princess to the kingdom of Jardine, since if they made a treaty, they would be able to import water from there for a long time. The emperor said that this hurt his pride. He looked at them with fury and asked if they really wanted to say that he, the emperor, should bow his head before some kingdom. Frozen in shock, the man said that the archbishop had also spoken in support of the proposal. The man said that once they could fix the water issue, they would increase their military power and easily restore their imperial status. The emperor thought for a moment that the archbishop had spoken in favor of this proposal. He believed that there should be no problems. He knew that if he bowed just once, he would be able to get water for a long time at a cheap price. He understood that until now they had kept the princess alive. Because of the nomad's curse, they couldn't just leave her to die. The emperor said that the princess's intelligence was that of a small child. He did not understand how they could send her there. The man said that they would both certainly teach her so that she would speak as little as possible. The man said that although she was evil, she was very beautiful, and they should properly train her in the affairs of the bedroom. Then she would be suitable as a concubine. The emperor told his subordinates to come to an agreement with the kingdom and also to educate the princess. He also said that they should speed up the search for the man chosen by the gods. He said that they needed to contact the temple so that they would not interrupt the prayers. Osiris was taken aback as she heard a strange sound. She knew that it was not yet time to visit the servants. A moment later, the maids looked into her dungeon. A moment later, with lightning speed, they grabbed her by the arms. She was in shock, wondering if this was a new kind of abuse. She screamed for them to let her go. A moment later, the maid slapped her across the face with fury. The maid looked at her with disdain and said that if she did not want to be beaten even more, she should obediently follow them. The maid looked closely at her subordinates and told them to hurry. The young lady was in shock and screamed at the maids to let her go because she was in pain. She was puzzled because she did not know where they were taking her. She screamed that she was in great pain. The maid sighed heavily and said that she had had enough of them. The head maid looked at them and said that they should be patient for a little while. She said with a smile that it would rain very soon. Osiria, in turn, understood perfectly well that this was not so, and not that even filth would not rain down on them. The maid said that the princess did not understand anything from their conversation. The lady was furious, as she understood everything perfectly. A moment later, she froze in place as they led her outside, and she saw the beautiful weather. She was shocked because it was the first time she saw the sky and it was different from the illusion Aqua created. She understood perfectly well that the fact that she had come out of the attic meant that her father, the Emperor, had found a way to throw her out. The maid smiled, looking at the princess, and said that she should go into the room. The young lady in turn hoped that she had finally had a chance to take revenge on them all. The head maid nudged the prince and told her to pass quickly. The young lady in turn froze in shock when she saw the bathroom. She was very excited and did not know what they wanted to do with her. A moment later, the maid tore the lady's outfit off. The lady was in shock. They poured water on her. The maid looked at the princess and told her to pass. The young lady was in shock as they were causing her unbearable pain. She sighed heavily as water poured into her nose and mouth. The maid, in her rage, shouted at the princess to sit still and not to cough or sneeze as it was too dirty. They shouted that she was not a person, but a trash can, because she smelled bad and the water was dirty. The head maid greeted the princess with a smile and said that after the bath, it became much more pleasant to be around her. She smiled and said that her name was Irina, and from today on she would be in charge of her education. The young lady was a little puzzled and surprised. She did not understand what they were going to teach her. The princess made a long sound, but a moment later she received a strong slap in the face. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. Irina looked at her with disdain and said that she froze because of just one slap. She told the princess that it seemed like she had really been living happily all this time. Irina angrily told the princess that from now on, she was not allowed to make such immature sounds. She told the princess that if she did not do as she said, she would certainly punish her. The princess let out another long, drawn-out sound. But a moment later she was slapped again and fell to the ground. The maids mocked her. Irina glanced sideways at the maids and told them to lay her on the bed. The young lady was in shock as she thought she would die from the pain. They threw her on the bed carelessly. Irina furiously told the princess to remember everything perfectly and not miss anything. Irina said that when the princess goes to the kingdom, she will have to obey. Irina told the princess that she was incredibly stupid, so she would only teach her the basics. Irina reached for the young lady's legs and began to spread them. Osiria froze in shock. But a moment later, she kicked the head maid in anger. Irina, in turn, hit the princess with fury. She looked at her with contempt. At the same time, the maid broke the princess's nose. She said that the training would continue until she began to follow the instructions perfectly. Irina looked at the princess with disdain and a smirk and said that if she understood everything, she should lie back down on the bed. The princess agreed with her, but in her heart, she promised herself that when the time came, she would kill her first. A spacious room, a huge window, good and fresh food, new clothes. They treated her like cattle right before they sold her. She wondered if they were going to send her away as a plaything for the aristocrats, but she knew that was not the case, since the emperor had pride. She knew they couldn't get rid of the princess like that. She assumed they would sell her to another country. She had endured 20 years in a cramped mansion, and compared to that, all this was nothing. A moment later, the young lady called out to her only friend. Aqua asked her mistress if she had called her. She told Aqua that the light around her had become brighter. Aqua said that it was much easier for her to use her power here since the interference that was there before was gone. She realized that when she appeared in the attic, strange patterns appeared everywhere. She asked if they were holding back her power. Aqua is a water spirit that has been with her since early childhood. She said that she was born to fulfill her wishes and protect the chosen one. She looked at Aqua and asked if she could tell her what happened. Aqua told her many things about this country and its situation, about her mother who met a terrible death, and about revenge. Aqua said that they were going to send her to the kingdom as a concubine in exchange for cheap imports of water and food. She looked at her friend and asked what kind of place the kingdom was. A moment later, a portal appeared near her. Aqua told the young lady that what she was currently looking at so intently was the capital of the Water Kingdom. Osiris looked closely at her reflection and said that although it seemed like a nice place, the people there were also disgusting. She looked at her reflection with disdain and said with a smirk that she was being sent as a sex slave. Aqua asked the lady if she should kill that maid when she returned. The lady said that she couldn't do that yet. She sighed heavily and said that the most important thing now was to carry out her revenge. She wanted to get out of this place as soon as possible. Aqua looked closely at the lady and said that everything was correct, and now we need to wait for the moment when the empire itself will lower God's hand. The endless sky and the many mountains were a beautiful sight, as if it was overflowing her, but now she did not enjoy it. She was in shock because she didn't think that just the move would last a whole month. She was riding in a carriage, and she felt very sick. But she knew perfectly well that being seasick in a carriage was better than being seasick on a ship. Every day she washed her body and put on luxurious clothes, and then was subjected to excruciating beatings. She understood that such actions really break a person, because for the first time she was inside a storm of fear and shame. She knew that everything had to endure, because if she had left the empire herself, then probably another chosen one would have been born. She understood that this should not happen, and she had to receive a reward for her suffering. She wanted to destroy the sacred empire that had forgotten its holiness. She felt very sick, but she was not going to give up. Aqua asked her mistress if she should kill everyone present, as she saw how her mistress was suffering. The young lady only sighed heavily. In fact, she wanted to kill everyone right now, but she knew perfectly well that she needed to be patient. She told Aqua that completely breaking off relations with the empire was just the beginning. She wanted to grow an overwhelming force and make rain fall on the entire world. She wanted to cover the sky with showers that were supposed to fall in empires. In other countries, she wanted to finish it all with her own hands. The young lady looked out the window in surprise as she saw that the royal castle was beginning to come into view. She knew it was a beautiful place, even though the empire seemed beautiful to her on the outside, even though it was hell to her. The young lady stepped onto the ground with her last strength. She was puzzled and felt ill. She understood perfectly well that in this place her future would be decided. She knew that usually a hostage is presented as a gift to the king. She wanted to fall into the hands of a man they would never have to see. The young lady stood frozen in place as she heard the king being greeted, but she could not see anyone because of the men standing in front of her. The maid pinched the young lady and told her to stand still. The princess could barely hold back her tears from the pain. The princess was shocked, but wondered if the maid would behave like this until the very end. The king said they had come a long way. He asked why they didn't all sit down first. He said they could sit where they were standing. The man asked the king if he really didn't care about the imperial delegation. The king asked with a grin if there was anything that could humiliate them. He said that the greeting was used only in their country. He looked at the man and asked, "Does the imperial delegation really care nothing about the etiquette of his state?" The man was very angry. They did as the king wanted. The lady in turn understood that it was time for them to realize that now the empire would not be as respected as before. The king looked at the princess and told her to come forward. The king looked at the princess closely and asked even if they had problems with water, wasn't it too much to send the princess as a concubine? He said with a grin that although she was half out of her mind, the young lady in turn froze in place. She understood that since everything had already turned out this way, she needed to pretend to be a little more stupid. She understood that if he found out that she was a complete idiot, then he himself would stop being interested in her. Irina told the king that they knew he was very worried, but the princess was more beautiful than any woman in the empire. Irina said that one incident had made her stupid, but she was still a quick learner. They had trained her so that she wouldn't cause any trouble. The young lady was very angry because she knew that every word Irina said was complete nonsense. She certainly couldn't say that she had gone crazy because she had been locked up since childhood. The man said that due to long-standing trade relations, the emperor was handing over the precious princess to the king. The young lady was a little puzzled. She didn't understand why the king had such a lackluster reaction. She wondered if he didn't like her. She understood perfectly well that this would not work, and she had to stay in the kingdom by any means necessary. Looking at the king, she froze in place, as she did not understand what this unusual piercing gaze was. She froze in place, looking at the floor, as she was very afraid of him. A moment later she looked at her hand, as she knew that her pattern had lit up, but she knew that no one but her could see the pattern. The king looked at the princess and told her to raise her head and look at him. The young lady froze, as the king was the first person she had ever felt this way about. She wondered if he was really human. The young lady in turn obediently did what the king ordered her to do. She in turn doubted that he was a man. Strange sensations came over her, and even now it seemed to her as if he was peeling off her entire body. Irina came closer to the princess and called her. Irina looked closely at the princess and quietly said, "Beta soon." I raised my head and did everything as she was taught. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she needed to continue doing everything as before. The king looked at her intently with a smile on his face. The king looked at the man and said that they had previously said that they needed food and water. The man said that they had requested this exchange as a sign of friendship. The king looked at those present and said that he thought so, but he did not understand why they had sent the princess. He looked at the princess with a grin and asked if the emperor really led a dissolute lifestyle. The young lady in turn froze, as these words were unpleasant to her. The man looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady looked at the king intently, as she felt as if these words were aimed at her. He seemed to imply that without her, the empire's problems would be solved, and she wondered what the king was going to do with her. The king looked at the delegation with a smile and said that he liked everything and that they should convey the temperature that he would accept it with gratitude. For a moment he frowned, as he had to think it over carefully. He wanted to decide what was the best way to proceed with the shoot. A moment later, the king called for Sir Fidelius, who meekly approached the king. The lady in turn looked intently at the knight. The king told him that he would look after the princess, as there was no suitable place for her in his royal castle. Everyone froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear such a thing from the king. Osiria knew full well that he was lying. She wondered if it made sense that there was no place for her to stay in the spacious castle. The knight asked the king for forgiveness and said that he was not very smart and therefore did not understand the meaning of his order. The king said that this was his gift to the knight, who had refused all the rewards he had bestowed upon him. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this was a very good idea. She knew he had no intention of sending her back. It was obvious to her why he was behaving this way right here and now. He handed over the gift to his subordinate, who had arrived, thereby smearing the empire's pride with dirt. She saw that the king wanted to show the empire its place. The delegation was shocked. They did not understand how the king dared to hand over the imperial gift right in front of the delegation. They understood that it was all because it didn't reign in the empire, because of one damned girl. They were furious because they had to endure this because of a crazy woman. Not long ago, they shifted all the blame onto a powerless nomad, and after her death, the arrows of all sins were directed at her daughter. She understood perfectly well that they could talk as much as they wanted, because in any case, she had already determined their end. The king asked the knight if he would accept the gift. He wanted the knight to start taking an interest in girls. The knight said that he would certainly obey the king's order. The king looked at the princess with a grin and said that he was very glad that the knight accepted the princess, leaving him satisfied. The king looked at the delegation with a smile and said that he thought it would suit his sword, not him, and he hoped that no one was upset about it. The young lady looked at them intently. She wondered if the king hated the knight. The king looked at the princess and asked if they could limit themselves to the box given by the emperor and return the princess back. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why the king kept playing with people. She knew that this would not happen. The empire would not like to take her back. Either she was afraid and did not want to return to the dungeon. The man told the king that she had been given to him as a sign of friendship so he could do whatever he wanted. The king said he would prepare a banquet so they could have some fun before leaving. They thanked the king for his concern. The young lady froze in place as she heard the delegation leave. She was glad to be abandoned. She realized that the strong chains that had been restricting her body had completely broken. Thus, the empire finally lost its divine power. She knew that they had let go of God's hand on their own. The king told the knight to take the princess, and they could be free. For today, the knight meekly agreed. The young lady was distracted from her thoughts as she completely forgot that the knight had also stayed with her. She didn't know what to do and wondered if she should call Aqua, but she knew she might get exposed. The knight slowly approached her and gently asked the princess if she could stand up. The young lady looked at the knight intently as he had startled her when he approached her. She was perplexed and wondered why he treated her with such respect. The princess looked intently at the knight and made a long sound. He looked at her intently, but a moment later asked her to forgive him. The young lady was in shock as he slowly and gently lifted her into his arms. She pressed herself closer to him. As he did it suddenly, the knight looked at the emperor and said that they would leave first. Osiris was shocked and wondered if he would just leave. After doing something like that, she almost screamed in surprise. The young lady looked closely at the king. She knew that once she got out of the castle, she would need to find out more about the king. She was completely sure that Aqua knew something about him. She saw his smirk. Looking at the princess, the king asked with a grin if she got what she wanted. The young lady froze in shock. She wondered what he had just said since she hadn't heard it. She was a little puzzled, for she knew that the king had made no sound, only moved his lips, but she knew that she could not be mistaken. He asked her if she got what she wanted. She was puzzled by his question. Now she was completely sure that he had known from the very beginning that she was okay. She knew that the kingdom was a country that received the blessing of water. She wondered if he saw Aqua's hidden pattern. She thought for a moment, as the color of his eyes reminded her of Aqua. Their eyes met for only a moment, but unfortunately, her body was still shaking. She wondered if she should kill him. She wanted to talk to her spirit. She was puzzled, and it didn't seem to her at all that she could kill the king. The knight squeezed her tighter in his arms. She looked closely at the knight and wondered if everything would be okay with this man. Even though he had to carry a crazy girl in his arms, he didn't seem angry. The young lady sighed heavily and fell asleep quietly in his arms. It was the first time someone had ever hugged her, and now she felt a human embrace. He looked at her closely and asked if she had felt any discomfort on the way to the kingdom. The young lady froze in place as he spoke to her too politely. She sighed heavily, as she had never heard anything like it in her entire life. She timidly asked him to leave, as she did not like him. The young man froze in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he stepped into the carriage and walked closer to her, the young lady looking at him with fear. She was in shock and didn't understand why he suddenly approached her. The young man looked intently at the princess and asked in bewilderment if he was really scaring her. She was shocked and wondered if he was going to get mad at her. She thought it was all very strange. The knight came closer to her and looked at her intently. She did not understand why he treated her with such respect. Her heart began to pound as she felt uncomfortable. A moment later, she shouted that she wanted to go home. She pushed him away and started screaming for him to let her go, as she wanted to go home. The knight raised his hand, and the young lady in turn closed her eyes because she thought that he wanted to hit her. He gently placed his hand on hers and asked her not to do that, as the seats were hard and she might get hurt. He said that it must have been very difficult for her to get to the kingdom, and that they would hurry up and head to his house first. The lady froze in place, wondering if he really thought she would fall for his stupid acting. She was confident in her ability to pretend. She knew that the further she went, the more carefully she would need to hide her true appearance. She looked at him with a smile and said that she liked the house, and she wanted to go home. The knight froze in shock as he looked at the lady and her radiant smile. She knew that he was being kind to her for a reason. She knew that in order for no one to be able to guess her intentions, she had to pretend to be a stupid child who had been ignored for a long time. She knew that in this world, there are no completely and entirely good people. There are only people with good and bad patience. Osiria saw that the man had good patience, and most likely, if he was not irritated, he would not beat her. She understood perfectly well that she still had to be careful with him, because she knew that quiet people are scary when angry. The young lady frowned as she felt very ill. She was breathing heavily, and at the same time she was trembling. The knight looked at her closely because he saw that she was not feeling well. He asked if she was okay, as she looked like she was seasick. He came closer to her and, asking for forgiveness, said that it would be quick. She froze in shock. The young man reached unsuccessfully for the young lady's corset. She trembled and said that she was wrong. He froze looking at her, but did not answer. A moment later, he slowly untied her corset. The young lady sighed heavily and took a deep breath. The knight asked if she was feeling much better, as he thought it was all because of her uncomfortable clothes. He asked her to lean on the other side and also asked her to give him her hand. The knight took the young lady by the hand and slowly pressed on some points on her hand. The young lady froze in pain. She screamed in a hurry that she was in a lot of pain. He looked at her and said that it was not pain. She trembled and told the knight that she was wrong. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that it hurt. The knight slowly let go of her hand. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she was feeling very seasick. He asked tenderly why they didn't walk. The young lady froze in shock, wondering if this man was a fool. She understood that he was trying to talk to a person who did not understand the words. She was shocked because no one had ever asked her anything before, because they knew it was just a waste of time. She saw that he didn't look stupid enough not to realize it, wondering if he was trying to test her. He said that it was not far to the house, and they could walk. He asked if she minded. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would go on foot. She wanted to get out of the carriage as quickly as possible. The maid said with a smile that she had other things to do, and she had to go, but if the lady needed anything, she could ring the bell. The young lady froze. She turned around because she heard some rustling. She looked intently at the young maid, who was peeking out from behind the door. The maid looked at the lady with a smile and said that she would return a little later so the lady could rest. The princess was in shock and did not understand what kind of child it was, and her head was ringing from the noise. She was surprised and could not even imagine that the servants would be so kind to her. She looked closely at the bell that was in the corner. The young lady sighed heavily and, sitting on the bed, called Aqua. A moment later she squinted as a very bright light illuminated her. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she saw Aqua in all her beauty. Osiria looked at the spirit in surprise and asked if she really was Aqua. Aqua said that it was of course her, and thanks to coming to the kingdom, overflowing with water energy, she had finally returned to her true form. The young lady looked at the spirit in surprise and said that she unfortunately did not know whether Aqua was a boy or a girl. Aqua said with a smile that she has no gender. Aqua asked her mistress if she felt that her connection with the Empire had finally been severed. She said with a smile that of course she felt it, and had no idea that she would be so happy with the feeling of freedom. Osiria said that now all that was left was to get out of this place. Aqua asked why she needed to leave. Osiria looked at her and said that she was sold to this country. She said that unfortunately she could not become free. Aqua said that if that was the problem, she would try asking the king. The young lady was surprised. The princess looked at her and asked if she knew the king. She said she thought he saw the pattern she had hidden, and it seemed he had seen through her game. Aqua smiled and said that everything would go well. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why. Osiria understood perfectly well that she knew everything but was beating around the bush and changing the subject. She said that she did not want to ask the king for anything, as he was very suspicious. Aqua sighed heavily and said that since the mistress said so, she would follow her will. She said that the kingdom was the best place in the world. Aqua said that there was no bad energy coming from that night. The young lady in turn understood everything perfectly well, but for some reason she felt uncomfortable. She knew she would be much better off if he treated her casually. Aqua flew up to the lady and said with a smile that she no longer had to pretend. She said about her mistress that she had sacrificed a lot up until now, and now Aqua wanted her mistress to live as she wanted. She said that she would like the owner not to deceive anyone and to live in a world where there was happiness, and she would be surrounded by care. The young lady was amazed. She was pleased to hear such warm words. She felt as if soft feathers were enveloping her heart. A moment later, the young lady froze in place, suddenly shuddering. She looked to the side and froze in shock as she saw her mother's severed head. She heard her voice. She said that she would stay here for a while and continue to behave in this manner. Aqua looked at her mistress and asked if she really thought so. She said that people are much more complex than creatures. Osiris thought for a moment, as she had previously thought, that Aqua was more human-like than her. Aqua asked if it would be considered strange if a person suddenly grew up. Aqua said with a smile that everything was very simple. The young lady looked at her with bewilderment. Aqua said that her owner could grow up to be just like her. The young lady froze for a moment. She remembered that when she was little, she looked at the world with the power of the asset. Back then, she learned one thing after another. She wondered if Aqua was telling her to do everything in the same order now. She thought about it because she knew it would take time, but it was a good way. Osiris looked at Aqua and asked if she really wouldn't tell her about the king. Aqua was taken aback. A moment later, they froze in place as they heard the maid calling for the princess. Aqua said that it seemed like someone had come, and she was already tired, so she would return to the pattern. The princess understood that she would have problems because she spoke too loudly. She nervously chewed her fingers. The maid calmed her down. She asked the young lady for forgiveness and hugged her tenderly. Osiris looked closely at the maid, for she was sure that she had grown up with good people and had never been spanked. The maid told the princess that she touched everything with her hands, and if she put them in her mouth, she would get sick. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she really couldn't do that. The maid looked at the princess with a smile and said that she was a good girl and that everything was just like that. She smiled and asked the princess to call her by name. The young lady froze in place, as she did not expect this. She wondered if Mary was speaking so abruptly on purpose. She wondered if the maid was afraid that she wouldn't understand her. The young lady looked at the maid intently. She did not understand what she wanted from her. The princess understood that the maid would not leave her alone so easily. A moment later, she called her by name. The maid hugged the princess with a smile, as she was very glad that she called her by name. The young man thanked Mr. Medhir for agreeing to the meeting. Medhir said with a smile that he could not resist the opportunity to try the new rare tea. Medhir said that this was his house, and it was very difficult to get an invitation to it now. He looked closely at the young man and said that it seemed that something had happened that he was having trouble coping with. Medhir asked if this had anything to do with the Trump Empire princess. He understood perfectly well that now he needed the help of the elder, who stood almost at the very head of the royal palace. Medhir sighed heavily and said that he saw the state the princess was in, as she looked like a little child. But what worried him more was how depressed she looked, and the high probability that she had grown up in an inappropriate environment. He knew that for a long time there had been some not-so-good rumors about the princess. They knew that in the empire she was called damned, and the whole motherland hated her. Medhir said that the empire had always relied only on God, and unfortunately, now their anger had turned on the princess. They were very sorry that she became a sacrificial lamb and completely unaware of anything. He knew that the king was initially going to refuse this gift, but suddenly changed his mind and accepted the princess. They were puzzled and did not understand why the king suddenly changed his mind and accepted her. They knew that he loved fun, but he also cared more about the people than anyone else. They did not understand why. Despite all this, he accepted the princess. But the most important thing was that he could not guess the reason why he handed the princess over to him. He wondered if the king wanted to see him in trouble. He looked at the doctor and asked if there was any chance that the princess would return to her original state. He said that she gets scared even when she just makes eye contact with him. He understood that the princess would live in this estate, and there would be many problems if she continued to be afraid of him to such an extent. Meteor smiled and said that he now understood why he was called. The young man smiled looking at him and said that he was a doctor and should know how to deal with mentally ill people. Meteor looked intently at the young man and told him to try to teach her to speak first. He froze in surprise. He looked at the doctor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The doctor said that it was not difficult. The doctor said that if the princess's development had stopped at the level of a small child due to shock or the environment, he would not be able to cure her. But if she hears a lot of different words and sentences and experiences strong emotions, she might feel better. The young man was shocked and wondered if this could concern him too. Sir Factilius was alarmed and puzzled, for he knew that all day long the only time he had opened his mouth was to answer His Majesty's questions and give orders to the knights during training. He wondered if he really needed to teach her to speak. The doctor looked closely at the knight, as he knew that he was known for his silence, so this task would probably not be easy for him. He was puzzled because he understood perfectly well that it would be easier if the matter concerned not words, but a sword. He remembered her and her fragile body. He was puzzled because he saw that she was very thin, like a fallen branch, and light as a sheet of paper. He had never met such a person in his life, no matter how much he thought it was impossible for him. Sir Factilius sighed heavily and said that he would rather have Mary and Pedro handle everything. He said that they would like the princess better than he did. Meteor looked closely at the knight and said that of course he was free to decide everything as he wanted, but he should not forget about his position. Looking at the knight, he said that although the princess was in a terrible state, she was still a princess from another country. Meteor looked intently at the young man and said that excessive interest and unnecessary displays of love would all become poison for her. He sighed heavily and said that if war broke out with the Empire, the princess would be the one he would be obliged to kill first. Sir Factilius sighed in confusion and said that he would remember that. Mary looked at the princess with a smile and said that she would quickly bring her food, so she needed to wait a little. Mary looked at the princess puzzled and said that she shouldn't be so picky, otherwise she would be sad. Mary asked the princess with a smile if she wanted to wash herself. She said that she would definitely take care of the water temperature. Mary looked at the princess with a smile and said that she could trust her. The young lady in turn was puzzled. She thought that, at this rate, she would go crazy. It seemed to her that her head was full to capacity with the word Mary. The young lady wondered if Mary wanted her to call her by her name. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that no one had ever called her by name, and therefore she could not understand her. She was surprised because she realized that it was pleasant to wash before release. Mary said with a radiant smile that the host should come a little later before the meal. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that it would be ideal if no one came to her. She was puzzled and wondered when those people would leave her alone. Meteor looked at the princess with a smile and greeted her. He smiled and said that he was just an insignificant doctor who served at the royal palace. The young lady in turn looked intently at the man. She asked if he was a doctor. He said with a smile that he was a doctor. He said softly that people of this profession treat other people. He looked at her with a smile and gently asked if she could give him her hand for a moment. The young lady in turn became wary, as she did not understand why he needed her hand. A moment later she froze in place as she heard someone's voice. Aqua told her master not to be scared since it was her. She said that the water's power had increased, so now she could talk to it inside her mind. She said that she could now use a wider variety of spells. Aqua said that a person who has God's pattern is able to borrow God's power. The young lady looked at the doctor intently as her spirit's words calmed her down. He looked at her intently and told her to give him her hand quickly. A moment later, the young lady finally extended her hand to him, and the doctor asked the princess what she usually ate. She looked at him in surprise, but he said he was talking about food. The young lady decided not to break her role and said with a smile that she did not like hard bread. She liked sweets. She asked them to give her sweets. The young gentleman looked at the lady intently. He was furious and could barely contain his emotions. The doctor was silent for a moment and did not answer. The young lady looked at them in surprise, as she did not understand what had happened. She froze, not understanding what had happened to the atmosphere. She wondered if she had said something wrong. Mary looked sideways at the princess and said that she would be back soon. She smiled, looking at the princess, and said that the princess could have a good time alone. The princess agreed with the maid and told her to come back. A moment later, the princess called the maid by name. Mary was shocked and ran up to the princess like lightning and hugged her tightly. She said with a radiant smile that she would quickly return to the princess. The young lady was in shock in turn. She couldn't breathe, and it was infuriating her. Osiris was in seventh heaven, as the maid had finally left, and she was left alone. The young lady was in shock, as she was very tired of such people. A moment later, the princess used magic and told Aqua to come out quickly. With lightning speed, the princess grabbed Aqua and shouted at her. She wanted to escape from the estate. Aqua looked at her mistress in bewilderment and asked why she suddenly wanted to do such a thing. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled. She shouted that no matter how hard they tried, she could not get used to these people. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said that they were all very kind and polite towards the princess. The young lady sighed heavily and asked what difference it made to her. She looked away into the distance and said that she didn't care. She thought for a moment, as she initially felt uncomfortable about pretending to be a little child in front of them and deceiving them. She looked at her friend and said that the important thing was that now was not the time for all this. She knew that she needed to escape and take all the remaining water from the empire. She looked at Aqua and said that they did have something they had to do. Osiria said that first they must dry up the rivers and lakes that she had maintained for her life. Then she wanted to go around the villages near the empire and reveal to them who she was, and on the appointed date, bring rain. She knew that then rumors would spread day by day, and the empire, driven into a dead end, would find out about her. Aqua sighed heavily and said that there were many guards outside, and if the mistress went out in a hurry, she would definitely be caught. The young lady looked out the window and saw all the guards. She was puzzled and wondered if there was nothing that could be done. Aqua said with a smile that, with the help of divine power, one can walk on water. The young lady said that it would be too noticeable, and she didn't think that such a thing would be of much help in escaping. Aqua told her mistress that if there was only water, then anything could be done, and if she jumped into the water, she could move to another place with water. Aqua told her mistress that there was not that much water in this room, but there was another way besides this. She looked at her mistress and asked how about making her wings out of water so that she could fly through the sky. The young lady looked at Aqua in surprise and asked if that was possible. Aqua smiled, looking at her mistress, and said that of course it was, and there was nothing she couldn't do with water. Aqua smiled and said that most of the things she could do were also something her mistress could do. She smiled and told her mistress to try it right now. Aqua smiled and said that in order to make wings, she simply had to imagine them coming out of her back and fluttering. The young lady was shocked, wondering how it was even possible to imagine such a thing. Aqua asked her mistress if she was ready to take off. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really. Now Aqua smiled and said that she would be free after all she had spent her whole life in the dark attic. The young lady froze in place, as she knew that this was exactly the case, and with the speed of lightning, she opened the window. She told her friend that she did not know what she was talking about, but she would try anyway. She looked at her friend closely and said that she didn't know if it would be wings or something else, but she was going to jump out of the window with them. The young lady stood on the balcony for a while. A moment later, she told the activists that she was ready. She looked sideways at Aqua and told her to make her wings now. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and asked if she would come back later, as she was very worried that her mistress might fly too far. The young lady looked at Aqua with a smile and asked what she was talking about. She said that she would just fly away and never come back again. She asked Aqua if she had forgotten how she had endured all this time and waited for this moment. Aqua was shocked, as she didn't expect this. Osiria told Aqua that Beta was also following her. Aqua worriedly shouted to her master to wait there for a bit, as she was doing everything too fast. Aqua screamed, but it was all in vain, as the young lady jumped out of the window with lightning speed. But a moment later, the young lady was floating in the air with beautiful wings behind her. The young lady was shocked and very happy because she understood that she had won. She was shocked and could not believe that she could really fly in the sky. She said that she would be able to fly freely to any point in the world. But a moment later, her wings began to disappear little by little. She began to fall, and Aqua looked at her mistress very worriedly and called her. Aqua screamed and called for her mistress, but it was all in vain. The young lady in turn fell to the ground with lightning speed. She was in shock and wondered what had gone wrong. Osiria wondered if she was really going to die like this. But a moment later, she opened her eyes and saw that she was all right. Turning around, she saw that she was sitting in the water. But after she touched the water, she started to fall. Aqua rushed to her mistress and, with tears in her eyes, asked her if the young lady was okay. Osiria sighed heavily and said that she was fine, but she really thought she was going to die. Aqua asked the owner if she was hurt anywhere. Lady said that fortunately, she only hurt her butt a little and that's all. Aqua cried and said that it wasn't her doing it, as the power suddenly weakened. Osiria looked at Aqua with a soft smile and told her not to worry, so much as she did not think that Aqua was to blame at all. And all this happened because she was in a hurry. Aqua flew up to her mistress with lightning speed and began to hug her, as she was very worried about her. But a moment later, they heard some noise. The lady heard that they were looking for her. Osiria glanced sideways into the distance and told Aqua to hide quickly, as people were approaching them. She heard someone approaching and saying that the princess had fallen out of the window. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled. She understood that she would have problems because she had made too much noise. She knew that they would definitely want to interrogate her. She was excited and did not know how to justify herself in this situation. A moment later, young people ran up to her and asked excitedly if she was okay. Mary wanted to know if she was hurt anywhere. The young lady, in turn, froze in place, not knowing how to react to this. She did not understand why the maid was crying in front of her and not angry. The maid, with tears in her eyes, told the princess that she was very glad that the princess was okay and not hurt. Fidelius came closer to the young lady and asked the maid if the princess was hurt anywhere. Mary said that the princess was fine, and it seemed that she fell on a pile of grass. He looked at her closely and asked what she had been doing. He was very glad that she was not hurt. She looked closely at the young man and realized that her body had been given to him by the king himself, and he would be in trouble if it was damaged. She sighed heavily, for she thought that he was a very stupid knight. Fidelius tenderly lifted the princess in his arm and told Pedro that he should just in case contact the doctor so that he could come to them tomorrow. Pedro looked at the young gentleman and said that tomorrow he would call the architect and find out if something like the fittings could be done. Fidelius looked intently at the butler and said that it would be better that way. The young lady froze, looking at everyone present. She didn't understand why they were looking at her like that. She knew that Aqua had always been with her, and she was her only family, so her excitement was obvious. The young lady froze, looking at the maid. She understood that all these people were in no way connected with her. She did not understand why they were so worried. She wondered if it was possible to start treating a person so friendly in just a few days. She was sure that the maid had some hidden intentions. Osiris didn't know why, but she still felt like she shouldn't be here, like she was standing on a thorny vine. He looked at her intently, as he was confused. He wondered what she was even thinking that she jumped out of the window. Fidelius was very worried, and hoped that she did not jump out of the window on purpose. He wanted to forget about it, because he thought that it probably all happened by mistake. He understood that, even though she had the mental age of a child, she was able to understand if she was being treated badly. He understood that she could simply want to run away, or that no one had ever told her about what could be dangerous. He thought that perhaps she needed training. The doctor looked closely at Fidelius and said that, unfortunately, the princess had the consequences of bullying. The young man froze in place from shock. The doctor told him that she had probably been exposed to them regularly for a long time since she had fresh wounds on her body. She was underweight, had malnutrition, and also anemia. Meteor sighed heavily and said that it seemed to him that no one had been watching her for a very long time. But despite this, he did not notice any obvious illness. The young man was shocked by what he heard, looked at the gentleman, and asked if she was not a princess. The doctor sighed heavily and said that because of the curse she had received, the entire empire hated her. He said that the environment can have a very detrimental effect on the human body and soul. If the princess had been bullied for a long time, or neglected for a long time, this could well explain her current condition. Meteor looked at the young man intently and said that unfortunately she had been abused, but that was his assumption. The young man was very puzzled by this information. He knew that the princess's room had not yet been fitted with fittings, and there was no guarantee that in the future the princess would not do the same. He understood that a little earlier she was lucky that she remained in order. He understood perfectly well that it was still dangerous to leave her alone in the room. He sighed heavily, for he knew that this had been the case since ancient times, and he had often heard that he had become too attached to someone, and this did not suit him at all. Although he was born into a family of knights who were supposed to be the first to draw their swords when war came, his gentle nature made everyone worry. From time to time, he saved weak animals from natural selection. He knew perfectly well that it was all because he couldn't just watch someone kill them. However, all the animals he brought were thrown out by his father, and in the end, he couldn't save anyone. He decided for himself that he would never make the same mistake twice, but he in turn believed that even with the passage of time, old habits did not disappear completely. He was puzzled because he knew that the problem was that this time it was not an animal, but a living person. He knew that this was a princess from another country, someone whom he might have to kill someday. He knew he would have to cut her down like a dry log. He knew she could break from a slight push. He couldn't look at her without pity, and he was unable to take his eyes off her. He understood perfectly well that even though that frightening father was no longer around, he now had a person whom he swore to protect. He knew that his heart had taken a certain side and the balance of the scales had been upset. He knew the balance had shifted only a little. Fidelius hoped everything would be all right. He knew that if he only stepped where he could, albeit with difficulty, but with determination, control his feelings, then someday having received an order, even if he doubted he would be able to find the sword. He supposed he could only hope that His Highness the King would not order his blade to be turned on her. He sighed heavily, as he was puzzled that at such an age he was making a wish like a little child. He knew that if they had met in a situation other than their necks being tied together, he might have been able to think of a slightly better ending. The young man sighed heavily, not knowing what to do, as this situation was very burdensome for him. The young lady woke up early in the morning and sighed heavily, as she felt as if her head was about to crack. A moment later she froze in place, as she did not understand where she was. She saw a beautiful, beautiful sky from the window. She wondered if she had fallen asleep in her room. A moment later, the knight called the princess. She froze, looking at him, and wondering if she had slept in the knight's room. She was a little surprised, and did not understand why he left such a spacious place and slept on the couch. Fidelius looked at her closely and asked if she had slept well, and also wondered if she was in any pain. She wondered why he was asking her such a thing, since he himself was sleeping on the sofa, and she was quite firm. She looked at him intently, since she knew that now he must realize that he would not hear any answer. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. A moment later, he asked her if she had a place where Boo Boo was. The young lady froze in place, looking at him. A moment later, she looked at him confusedly, not understanding what she had just heard. The young man looked away in embarrassment and began to mumble something under his breath. The young men looked at each other in confusion. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she wondered what was wrong with him. She was amazed and could not believe that the knight was saying such a thing. For a moment she doubted her hearing. He pulled her hand, embarrassed and unhurried, and said that it seemed that nothing hurt her, but just in case he would bring a doctor in the evening. He also said that the maid would soon prepare food. Milady looked at him intently, for she knew that he should be ashamed as she was. He looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said his name. He came closer to her and asked her to call him by name. The young lady shuddered as she did not expect him to be so close. She was shocked and did not understand why he was telling her such a thing. She turned away from him, and he in turn froze, staring intently at the princess. A moment later, he sadly asked her if she didn't like him. Fidelius timidly asked if she was really afraid of him. He wilted at the mere question. A moment later, he looked at her intently and asked if she had trouble saying his name. Osiria was shocked. She wondered when he would finally finish asking questions. She knew she had to say something quickly, and without looking up at him, she called his name. A moment later, the knight stated his name correctly. The young lady looked at him in surprise. He pulled her closer to him and corrected her earlier mistake. She froze in surprise, looking at the young man. A moment later, he was taken aback and moved away, as he realized that he was too close to her, and holding her hand, Fidelius timidly asked the princess for forgiveness and asked if she was scared. The young lady looked at the knight intently, as she was surprised. She felt that his hands were big but warm. He looked at her timidly and said that in any case she should call him by his name correctly. The young lady was shocked. She knew that the difference was not that big, and she made a small mistake in the name. A moment later she shouted several times, "His name is correct." The young man looked at the princess with a radiant and gentle smile and said that everything was correct, and also thanked her for calling him by name. The young lady froze in place as she saw his beautiful smile. It reminded her of a flower that was almost dead but suddenly slowly blossomed, and for some reason she could not take her gaze off him for a long time. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would soon have to leave for the palace, and he would call Mary, so she needed to wait in the room for a while. The young lady in turn agreed with him. He looked sideways at the window and told the princess that she must not go too close to the windows. He asked if she understood him. The young lady on Murom did not think about it because she saw that he seemed to be very scared yesterday. It seemed to her that now all eyes would be focused on her, because of which it would be easy to catch her, so she was not going to do anything. She understood perfectly well that she was not going to sit back and do nothing. She thought about the fact that the Imperial delegation would be returning back to the Empire around tomorrow. She knew that they would be traveling with the water they had received through the exchange. She wanted to empty the barrels before they arrived at the Emperor's castle. She knew that the idea, if the water barrels turned out to be dry after they had laboriously brought them. Having suffered for more than a month, she did not even imagine what kind of grimace her father would make. A moment later, she called Aqua. She told her friend that Mary would be coming soon, so she shouldn't go out and should listen to her. Osiris said that tonight she would go to meet Irina. She said that now she was talking about the woman who brought her moldy bread every day and beat her regardless of the time and situation. Aqua asked the mistress in surprise what she would do when she went there. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she didn't even know. She knew that the strong devoured the weak. She understood perfectly well that Irina had hurt her, and now she had become stronger than her. She asked Aqua, "I need to pay her back in kind." Aqua told her mistress that of course she was right. Aqua told her mistress that she would become her sword and shield, and would protect her all her life. Aqua said that at any moment her mistress wished she would become a tsunami and swallow everything. Princess said that today they would definitely go to Irina. Osiria knew that Irina had arrived with a delegation, and therefore she should still be in the royal palace. She knew that the price for pain could only be revenge, and revenge would end in death. Some time later, Mary came to the princess and brought her a lot of different food. She looked at the princess with tears in her eyes. The young lady sighed heavily. She had a very bad headache. She did not understand why Mary sniffled in front of her. She did not understand why she was always crying. Mary looked at the princess intently and asked if she was sure she didn't have any pain anywhere. The young lady sighed heavily, as she had already said 100 times that she didn't have any pain. Mary looked at the princess with tears in her eyes and said that she was just a terrible person because she did not tell the princess about some dangers. She told the princess that she should have watched her a little more carefully. She came closer to the princess and, falling on her knees, said that yesterday she really thought that her heart would settle down. Mary screamed that it was all her fault. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at the maid in bewilderment and wondered what she was even talking about. She didn't understand why the maid was doing this. The maid looked at the princess intently and asked if she could give her one single promise. Mary looked at the princess with tears in her eyes and asked her not to die. Mary told the princess that she would never leave her again and would always be by her side. Mary asked the princess to promise that she would always be by her side. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady looked closely at the maid, since from the moment she arrived at this estate, everything was filled with things that were incomprehensible to her. She didn't understand why Fideltus left the spacious bed and slept on the sofa, why Mary was sad and happy. She didn't understand why her heart suddenly ached so much. She only knew one thing, that if no one explained it to her, then she would not understand anything. In any case, she knew that now her primary task was to calm Mary down. She looked at the maid with a smile and said what she promised her. The maid, in turn, beamed with happiness. The young lady looked closely at the maid. She saw that she and the master were the same. The maid smiled and said that she would prepare a bath for her. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that it would have been better if they had introduced her to another maid. She knew that compared to the size of the estate and the number of rooms in it, the number of servants here was very small. She understood that the young master did not have a family. She had a feeling that the smell of people here was only in certain places. She really could not understand them. The king looked at the young man intently and said that he could come in. The king looked at the young man with a grin and asked if he had had a good night last night. Fidelus looked at the king intently and said that the princess slept without any discomfort, and he could say the same about himself. The king looked at the young man and said that the princess was surprisingly beautiful. The king asked the young man if he really meant to say that even looking at her, he did not lose his former calm. The king looked at him intently and told him to answer honestly. Fidelus knew perfectly well that if he played along with the king, there would be no end to it, even once. So in this situation, the best option was to not react. He looked at the king closely and said he thought that the princess was very weak, and it seemed that the princess had been rather poorly fed. And also after the doctor's examination, they realized that the princess had been greatly abused. The king looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Fidelus said that Mary's maid also reported that when she washed the princess, she saw many wounds all over her body. The king looked at him intently and said that the princess surprisingly obeyed him well. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was not so, and most likely she was afraid of him. The king looked at the young man intently, frowning. A moment later, he asked the young man with a grin if he knew the easiest way to tame an animal or predator. Fidelius looked at the king with bewilderment and asked if he didn't need to show him that he was above him. The king said with a grin that of course that was the surest way. A moment later, he came closer to the young man and said with a grin that it was easier to treat a wounded animal, and all because after the crippled animal received warmth, it could no longer live without it. The king said that after the animal felt the warmth it had never known in its life, it would never be able to leave the one who gave it. The young man looked at the king in surprise and asked in bewilderment, speaking of the mutilated animal, whether he really meant the princess. The king asked the young man with a grin what he thought about this. Fidelius thought for a moment, since judging by the way the king reacted, he thought that he did not intend to answer, but he understood perfectly well that the princess looked more like a small herbivore than a predator. Fidelius looked at the king intently and asked if he accepted the empire's request because of the princess. He said that as far as he knew, the king was originally going to reject it. The king froze in surprise, as he didn't expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, the king said with a smile that it was so, and he changed his mind after seeing Her Highness. He said that the imperial fools had confused the precious stone with an ordinary one and handed it over to him on their own. He said with a grin that this was the reason he accepted it. The young man looked at the king intently, and in surprise, he did not understand what he was talking about. He wondered if there was anything else he didn't know about the princess. The king looked intently at the young man, who was turning various thoughts over in his head. Fidelius wondered if he liked the princess. He understood that if this was really the reason, then most likely he left her with him now because of possible rumors. But as soon as everything calmed down, the king would take the princess again. The young man stood dumbfounded as he realized that he had simply terrible thoughts in his head. He was puzzled and wondered why such thoughts had entered his head. He understood that he must be thinking about such things, since his master was sitting in front of him. The king looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that his old and bad habit was returning to him again. The young man looked at the king in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The king smiled and told his friend not to make up any stories in vain, since he himself had handed the princess over to him. The king smiled and said that this meant that he would no longer be involved in her life in any way, that the decisions made and determining her future place of residence were all entirely his responsibility. The king smiled and said that the princess could well be a good chance for him, but certainly not something bad, even though he still has a headache because of her. The young man was taken aback and shouted to the king that he was not in any pain at all because of the princess. The king looked at the young man in surprise, but a moment later he looked at him intently with a grin on his face. The young man in turn hesitated timidly, not knowing what to answer. The king smiled and said that it was very surprising because it turned out that people could change so much. He looked at him intently and said that he could not even think that he, a vain man, was capable of forgetting his master because of a woman. Fidelius was shocked. He wondered why he even reacted to such words, since he understood that the king would hurt him with this for about 6 months. He looked closely at the king, knowing that he needed to control himself. A moment later, he looked sharply at the king and told him not to make him the target of his jokes. The king sighed heavily and asked what he could do, since he adored his stupid and loyal sword. Fidelius sighed heavily. He had once been deeply touched by such words. The king smiled and told his friend that he believed that he could cope completely. The king smiled and told his friend not to forget him because of his strong infatuation with the princess. The young man was shocked, as the king was once again treating him like a little child. He looked at the king intently and said that he understood everything, and now he had to leave. He knew that he had to leave before the king's jokes went too far. The king looked at him with a grin and said that he forgot to tell him something. He said with a smile that if there were any difficulties in his relationship with the princess, he could consult with him at any time. The king looked at the young man closely and said with a smile that, for example, he could give him advice about the first night. Fidelius froze in place, in embarrassment from shock. He looked at the king in surprise and asked what he was thinking about now. The king looked at him with a smile and told him to stop pretending that he didn't know anything, since they were no longer children. The young man, frowning, looked intently at the king, but said nothing. He was furious and knew he just had to ignore the king's words and endure it all. The king looked at the young man closely and asked with a smirk if he was playing the role of a man properly. The young man was burning with rage, but he controlled himself. A moment later, unable to bear it any longer, he came closer to the king and asked what he was talking about. The king sighed heavily and said that he had been watching him for a long time, but had never seen him with a woman before. Fidelius looked at the king intently and asked if he had time today, if he would like to spar with him once. The king looked at his subordinate with a beaming smile. He was having a lot of fun teasing him. The king looked at the young man with a grin and said that if he lost next time, he would bring the princess. The king said that if you think about it, it was originally his gift, and he was a little interested in that girl. The young man sighed heavily and said that he would not do that. The king looked at him in bewilderment. Fidelius said, in all seriousness, that he would certainly defeat him, and this would not happen. The king looked at him with a smile and said that his words were very commendable, and that this was exactly how one should respond. The king smiled and said that he had not visited the parade ground for a long time, and he was just bored. He told his friend to follow him. The young lady looked at Aqua and told her to let her know when all the people in the house were asleep. She looked at her intently and asked if she understood her. Aqua sighed heavily and said that she would inform her mistress about everything. The young lady looked at Aqua with confusion and asked what happened. She wanted to know if Aqua was still angry. Aqua drooped and said that she was not angry, although a little upset. Nosy could not do anything about it. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled. She did not know what to do with her friend. She knew that she had been acting like this all day because Mary had been with her all day, and they had no time to talk. The young lady understood perfectly well that yesterday's failed escape had become a huge hindrance. She understood that she needed to prepare more thoroughly. Osiria understood perfectly well that if they continued to watch her as diligently as today, it would become a big problem for her. Aqua flew closer to her and called her. She looked at her mistress and asked if she could go away for a while tomorrow. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was being discussed. Osiria looked at Aqua intently and asked what she was talking about and where she wanted to go. Aqua looked closely at the young lady and said that she wanted to meet the king. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she wanted to go to him, as she absolutely had to check something. The princess looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she needed to see the king. She was shocked and did not understand who the king really was. She asked her mistress for forgiveness and said that she could not tell anything about the king since she was not allowed to do so. She looked at her intently and said that if she violated this prohibition, then perhaps she would have to leave her mistress. The young lady froze in place, in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she looked at her friend closely and said that she agreed with her. The princess asked her if she would return in the evening. She said that, of course, she would return. The young lady knew perfectly well that she had no choice but to trust her and wait. And besides, she didn't want to cause Aqua any inconvenience. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said with a smile that, from tomorrow, she would teach her to control water. The young lady, in turn, wondered if she too would finally be able to control water. She hoped that she would succeed, and that she would finally be able to achieve her goal. Aqua looked at her mistress in surprise. As she was worried about something, the young lady sighed heavily and asked if she could kill people with this power. Aqua said with a gentle smile that it was very simple, and she could do it. She flew closer to the mistress and said that she could simply extend her hand to the enemy. She should simply wish that there was no more water left in the vessel called man. The young lady looked at Aqua in surprise and asked if it was really that simple. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and said that she was right, and it was an amazing thing. She was surprised that even with her own hands, she could easily kill a person. The young lady, in turn, slept quietly in bed. But a moment later, Aqua flew up to her and started shaking her to wake her up. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said that everyone had fallen asleep except for the patrol soldiers. The young lady glanced sideways at Aqua. She said that Fidelius, fortunately, had not come, as he had also said that he would bring a healer, but it seemed that he had forgotten about it. Aqua looked closely at the mistress and said that there was a violent energy raging in that man, and maybe something happened to him. Aqua said that he was snoring very loudly. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment, but did not answer. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that it did not concern her. A moment later, she came out onto the terrace, and looking at her friend, asked with hope in her voice if she would fall today or not. Aqua said that they had already tried several times, and after that incident, everything was fine. Aqua extended her hand to her owner, and she stepped in. Aqua smilingly told her owner that this night would be incredibly fun. Some time later, the young lady was floating freely in the air, and behind her back were beautiful water wings. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and said that she had succeeded. She was very glad that this time everything worked out as it should. Aqua looked at her owner with a smile and said that she really did everything right. Aqua smiled and asked her owner if she was ready to fly through the sky. Aqua told the young lady that she would instantly fly to the place where that maid was. Suddenly, old memories came flooding back to her mind. Memories of the first day she discovered God's pattern on her case. She was 5 years old when the God's pattern was discovered. Usually the God's pattern would appear within a year of birth, but due to the restraining curse, the seal's appearance was delayed. Thanks to this, no one could guess that she was a child of God, so it could be said that everything worked in her favor. In any case, even now she could not forget that moment. At that moment when she was almost dying while locked in the dark despair, but then a mysterious shining aura appeared in the darkness. It was an amazing sight that could not be described with any words. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said that they needed to move quickly. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that the same light was now emanating from Aqua, a beautiful shine that was not of this world. Osiris knew that Aqua was her only friend, and as long as she was by her side, she was not afraid of anything. After some time, they slowly approached the window. Aqua looked at her mistress intently and told her to look away. Aqua smiled and said that it seemed like they had arrived at the right place. The young lady slowly looked through the window and saw the sleeping maid. Osiris looked at the sleeping maid with fury and hatred. She said furiously that someone had to go through the pain of her leaving scars on a small child every day, and seeing her sleep so peacefully made her feel worse. Some time later, they entered the room. The young lady looked at her friend and told her to pour water on the maid. Aqua looked at her mistress and said that she would do whatever she wanted. A moment later, Aqua used her magic. With her magic, she created a ball of water which hovered above her. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise, as she knew that there wasn't even any water nearby. She wondered if Aqua had created it by condensing the moist air. She looked closely at the shark and said that there was enough water. Aqua looked at her mistress in bewilderment and asked if that was really the case. She said that she thought that even if she collected 3 times more, it would still not be enough. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the maid. She knew that the whole logic of the world could be explained by just one phrase: natural selection. A moment later, Aqua used her magic and doused the maid with water. The maid jumped up with lightning speed and sat on the bed. She did not understand what was happening at all. The young lady looked at the maid with disdain and said that it must have really hurt. Aqua, in turn, told her mistress that it hurt her much worse. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise. She was in shock and didn't understand what was going on. Osiris slowly approached Irina and greeted her. Irina was shocked and could not believe that now in front of her was a princess. Irina was confused and didn't understand what was going on. Looking at the princess, she wondered if she was just dreaming. The young lady slowly looked at Aqua and said that she had been hearing her name a lot lately. She sighed heavily and said that however all this time, Irina had never called her that. Irina shuddered and froze in shock as she saw the seal on the princess's hand. The princess looked at the maid with a grin and said that it was really hard for her. She came closer to her and said with a grin that she had been pretending to be a fool for more than 10 years, so it even seemed to her that she had really lost her mind. The maid looked at the princess in horror and turned her gaze to the spirit that was hovering near her. She froze in shock, not knowing what to say. The princess looked at the maid with anger and said that she was mocking a stupid princess who knew nothing about the world and was not even able to speak. She asked with anger whether she had fun mocking such a person, beating him, and constantly humiliating him. The young lady said that she had no intention of lengthening Irina at all. The princess looked at the maid intently and said that, speaking more precisely, it was all because of her weakness. And this goes without saying. She understood that the strong Irina was mocking her weak. The princess looked at the maid with fury and said that the situation was different now. She said that she was the one who was truly strong here now, and the weak Irina would die at her hands. Irina froze in horror. She was in shock and did not understand how this could have happened. With a trembling voice, she asked the princess if she was God's chosen one. The princess said with a grin that it was so, and it was a surprise to everyone that she was born in this generation with the pattern. She said that although none of them knew about it, she knew about everything, and even about how they killed her mother. She looked at Irina intently and asked with a smirk if she wanted to hear something interesting. The young lady said that the empire would dry up forever. All the rivers and lakes that were barely maintained would disappear. The princess, with fury in her eyes and a smirk on her face, told Irina that she would do it, using the divine power they so desired to completely destroy the empire. Irina said in a trembling voice that this simply couldn't be. She looked at the princess with despair and asked how she dared. She did not understand how this dirty, despicable girl could be the chosen one of God. Irina furiously shouted at the young lady that even if that was the case, she would not be able to destroy an entire country on her own, since the empire was very strong. The young lady stared at her with a smirk on her face. She asked Irina if she really didn't know anything. The princess said with a grin that it seemed like Irina really knew even less than she did, that she had been locked in the attic for 20 years. Irina looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The princess looked at her intently and said that the empire's past prosperity was entirely due to the chosen few to make it rain or to dry. Everything completely was not difficult. The princess said that, however, this was not enough. Osiris said that the people in power quickly left the empire and now live beautifully in other places. But she knew that this was not very fair. She said that she could make the drought spread, not only in the empire, but also in neighboring countries. She said that she could send powerful waves to the ships that were sent out and flood the roads and land. After the complete isolation of the entire continent on which the empire is located, spread rumors that the empire abandoned the princess with God's pattern, and that everything that happened was the fault of the Trump Empire, which completely forgot about God. The young lady looked at the maid with fury and contempt and asked how she felt about this idea. The maid froze in shock as she could not believe what she heard. She was trembling with fear. She looked closely at the princess and asked what she was even talking about. The lady in turn understood perfectly well that about half of what had been said to her earlier was a complete bluff. But she knew that everything would go perfectly according to the plan she had voiced because it was just her fantasy. She understood perfectly well that however it was obvious who the hatred of neighboring states would be directed at in a dangerous situation. Irina shouted in shock to the princess and asked if she really intended to destroy her own homeland. She was shocked and could not believe what she heard. The princess looked intently at the maid and calmly said that she was going to do it since she had been talking about it for so long before she was free. The maid froze in place from shock. She was very scared. The princess said with fury that all her life, that dirty and cramped attic had been everything to her. She looked at the maid intently and asked if the humiliation of one country would not be a suitable compensation for all the suffering she had to endure. The maid was shocked. She said in a trembling voice that it was murder. Irina screamed furiously that the princess wanted to commit murder using the power given to her by God. She screamed that the princess wanted to kill people with the power of salvation. She screamed and cursed the princess. The princess looked intently at the maid and, sighing heavily, said that everything could be as she said. She slowly approached the maid and asked if God gave her strength, and in the meantime they locked her up, beat her, and threw rotten bread as a handout. Shouldn't they be punished in this situation? Osiris asked with fury why when she had a fever they never covered her with a warm blanket. She looked at the servant with disdain and said so that she would answer her immediately. She asked why she was not allowed to kill people. Irina was trembling with fear. She said that it was impossible to kill people because of the law. The young lady in turn only laughed after her words. She knew she had memories that kept popping into her head over and over again when she was in the dark and icy attic where the sunlight rarely reached. The most terrible witch who cursed the empire and caused many people to die affectionately called her daughter by name. The witch she saw in her memories until she was brought to the place of execution. She smiled at the child in her arms. The princess pushed the maid angrily, and she fell onto the bed. The young lady was furious and wanted to get rid of her completely. She looked at the maid with fury and hatred, as she wanted the country called Trump to be mired in torment. She wanted the whole empire to feel the excruciating suffering. She wanted the empire to plunge into the abyss of despair. She wanted every inhabitant of the empire to feel all the torment that her mother felt before her death. The maid was trembling with fear and called for the princess. The princess looked at the maid with a grin and told her not to worry so much. The princess said with a smirk that she would not kill her right here and now. Osiris said that she would only make all the moisture slowly leave her body. She looked at the maid and said that she would dry her body and lips, and the inside of her mouth would start to crunch, and thirst would tear at her throat. The princess looked at the maid with hatred and said that she would do all this until she thought that it would be better if she died. The princess said that she would squeeze her endlessly. The young lady looked sideways at Aqua and asked how she could do it. Osiris said that it was unusual for her since it was her first time doing it. The rest she thought about and said that together with what she touched, a blue spot appeared. Aqua said it was a brand. The maid was shocked and looked at her shoulder where there was a black spot. Trembling with fear, she asked what it was. The young lady thought for a moment and, sighing heavily, said that it seemed she had succeeded. The young lady looked at the maid with a grin and told her to be happy since she was the first, but soon the whole empire would become like that. Irina glanced sideways at the princess. She was trembling with fear and rage and could not utter a word. The princess glanced sideways at the maid and said that since they had finished with today's business, it was time for her to return. Irina shouted after the princess that she would definitely tell everything she said, that she was telling everyone that everything was okay with the princess. She screamed that he would certainly tell about the princess being chosen by God. The princess looked at the maid with a smile and said that she would not want anything more than for Irina to spread such rumors alone. She said with a smile that no one would believe her. She asked Irina if they would believe that the princess who had lived for decades as an empty-headed fool was chosen by God. The princess grinned and told the maid to beg her best to save her life. The maid, bursting into tears, shouted at the princess that she was simply crazy. Irina shouted at the princess that God would not forgive her. Irina screamed furiously at the princess that she was a monster and the devil incarnate, and that she was also the offspring of a damn witch. The princess looked at the maid intently and said that when something bad happens to people, they try to find a reason for it, but if they cannot find it, they choose the weakest opponent and let off their steam on him. The young lady looked at Aqua and said that she felt a little sorry to go back like this. Aqua nodded in agreement with her mistress. The maid shuddered, not knowing what awaited her. A moment later, the maid froze in place as she saw a ball of water hovering above her head. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening at all. The princess looked closely at the maid and told her not to worry too much. The princess looked at the maid with a sharp and angry look and said that the nonsense she would tell everyone would definitely become true someday, and people would begin to believe her. The princess looked at the maid with disdain and said that this would happen after her death. Moments later, at the princess's command, Aqua used her power and doused the maid with water. The princess looked at the maid with a smile and said goodbye to her. She said that now she was glad that the maid looked as she should. As she left, the princess heard the maid begging her for salvation. Some time later, the young lady looked intently at the maid. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had finally done it with her own hands. She made the woman who beat her day after day feel the same horrors and fear that she felt. The princess understood perfectly well that the death of the maid would not come soon, but she knew that in the end, Irina would die slowly and painfully just as she wanted. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said with a smile that she was doing well. Aqua happily said that her owner was already getting used to controlling water. The young lady looked up at the sky and asked her friend to also look up at the sky. The young lady looked up at her beautiful sky as she was now seeing a landscape that she could not see from the attic. It was her first night in life that seemed so fresh. The maid looked at the princess intently and said that there was a lot of hot food served today, and so she would feed her herself. She looked at the princess intently and asked if she understood her. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she had no choice and had to obey. She opened her mouth in confusion to be fed. The maid looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she was a good girl. A moment later, Fidelius entered their room. Looking at the princess, he asked for forgiveness for not being able to come to her last night. He came closer to her and said that unfortunately he had some circumstances. The maid greeted the master with a smile. The young man stood timidly and stood there as he saw that the princess was eating. The princess was shocked and felt uneasy as she had to meet a man in such an inappropriate form. She wondered in confusion whether she should give it all up. Fidelius looked at the princess in surprise and called out to her. The young lady flinched as she didn't expect him to be so close. She sighed heavily as she knew she had to watch her expression. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was eating, and the food was very tasty. Fidelius looked at the princess in surprise and said that it seemed that she was starting to speak faster than he thought. The maid looked at the princess with a radiant smile and said that she was quickly repeating what you were teaching her. Fidelius looked at the princess intently and said to the maid that Mr. Meter also said to talk more with the princess, and he thought that since Mary was with the princess, there was no need to worry. Mary smiled and said that she stood and talked with the princess. The young lady in turn knew that this was the problem since the maid spoke without rest, and it seemed to her as if her eardrums were about to burst. The young people looked closely at the princess. They were surprised. The maid looked at the princess intently and surprised and said that it seemed that she could drink water on her own. Fidelius looked at the princess in surprise and said that she was simply incredible. Fidelius looked closely at the princess and asked if perhaps she knew what it was in his hands. Osiria looked at the young man with a smile and said that it was an apple. The maid looked at her master intently and said that the princess was an incredibly fast learner, and she was sure that the princess was a genius. She said that it was better to talk to the princess more, so that she would remember the words. Fidelius looked at the maid intently and said that he would certainly take care of this, and Mary in turn should talk more with the princess. The maid looked at her master with a smile and said that of course she would do everything, and he could trust her completely. The young lady in turn froze in shock. He looked at them intently and said that he had only stopped by for a short while, as he would have to leave soon, and he wanted to give her something. He handed her a package and said that the king had said that it was a gift for the princess. The young lady stood frozen in shock, as she could not believe that the king had given her a gift. She was surprised and did not know what was in it. The young man looked at the princess with confusion and said that she was probably seeing something like this for the first time, but it was called a toy. The young lady in turn froze in shock. A moment later she picked up the wand and stared at it. She looked at everyone present with a smile, but in her soul she was in shock and did not understand what this was all about. The young lady in turn was shocked as she understood that the king had told him to give her a gift, and he knew everything about her. She wondered, puzzled, if this was a challenge to a duel. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted to tell her something. Fidelius said timidly that he actually sparred with His Majesty yesterday, and he lost. The young lady stood frozen in surprise, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and said, puzzled, that they had been fighting. The young man mumbled something to himself on the tray, not knowing how to explain to her what had happened. Osiria, in turn, looked at him puzzled, since she did not understand what they were talking about. She knew perfectly well that he didn't need to explain anything to her, but he still tried. A moment later, he decided to show everything with a visual example. The young lady shuddered, as she did not expect to see such a sight. He looked at the young lady intently and said sheepishly that he had fallen, and that was called losing. He looked at her intently and asked if she understood what he was talking about. The young lady sighed heavily and looked away as she was going crazy. He looked at her in surprise. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that if the king won the sparring match against this knight, then he was not just. He looked at her intently and asked her not to be too disappointed. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Fidelius told the princess that next time he would win. Osiris looked at him intently. She didn't understand why her heart was pounding so much. He looked the princess in the eyes and said that His Majesty said that he wanted to meet her once. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was puzzled and did not understand why the king wanted to meet her so suddenly. A moment later, the young man began to explain to her, using the example of fruits, that the king wanted to meet her. He stood there embarrassed after his explanation. A moment later, he timidly said that he had things to do and needed to leave. The young lady thought for a moment about the king calling her for an audience. She wondered if it was related to what had happened. She knew perfectly well that no one had seen them. The maid looked at the princess with a radiant smile and asked if she would like to try the apple. The young lady froze for a moment, remembering the previous night. She remembered how the maid screamed and how she insulted her. A moment later, the princess pushed the maid away. Mary was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing from the princess. The maid looked timidly at the princess and asked excitedly if everything was all right with her. The princess looked at the maid with a smile. She did not understand why her heart was beating so hard. Fidelius thought for a moment as he took a shower, wondering what she was doing now. He looked closely at the table where the pencils and paper lay. He was sure that this would help in her development. He understood perfectly well that this was a good idea and it should be tried. Sometime later, he came into the princess's chambers, and looking at the princess, he said that he had returned. The princess was surprised and looked at him. She did not understand why he came to her again. He looked at the princess intently and said that he was a little late, and also asked how long she had been waiting for him. The young lady froze in place in shock. She looked at him in surprise as his wonderful scent reached her. He looked at the princess intently and said that it was soon dinner time and she was probably very hungry. He asked what she thought about eating together. The young lady turned away as she was very embarrassed. She did not understand why he was so close to her. She was surprised as it was putting a lot of pressure on her. She noticed that today he was also talking especially a lot. Osiris sighed heavily as he suggested that she eat together. She was sure that she would have indigestion after their meal. She did not want to agree to this, The young man looked intently at the princess and asked her to look at him. A moment later, he gently handed her the piece of paper with the drawing. The young lady looked at the drawing in surprise. Fidelius looked at the princess and said that this was food. He looked at the princess and said that the picture showed how to eat properly. Looking at the princess, he said that if she wanted to eat, she could just tell the servants about it. Fidelius showed her another drawing and said that by services, he meant this man who was depicted on the paper. The young lady thought for a moment. As she looked at the image, she thought that there was a capable artist in the estate. He looked at her closely and asked if she could figure out who it was. A moment later, the young lady saw a beautiful drawing and froze. Osiria stared at the drawing for a moment, wondering if it was Fidelius. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked if it was really him. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was true. He looked at her timidly and asked if she knew his name. Looking at the princess, he said that it was there and she had it too, and he was now talking about the name. A moment later, the young man called out to the gentle princess of his name. He said with a smile that he had heard that her name was Osiris. The young lady froze in embarrassment. She didn't understand why her heart was beating so fast. She was confused because he didn't call her princess, not a child witch or empty-headed fool. She was shocked because he called her by her name. Osiris froze in shock and confusion, as she now understood what it felt like to have someone call him by his name without hatred or anger. A moment later, she called his name softly, and he flinched. The young man timidly asked her to call him again. The young lady looked at him shyly. Fidelius looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she could say again what she had just said. The young lady timidly looked away from him. She did not understand why he kept asking her. She was embarrassed by this. She knew that there would not be a second time. A moment later, the maid entered the room and called her master. Mary looked at the young men in surprise and said that she had been looking for the master everywhere. She looked at them with a smile and said that the preparations for the meal were complete. He looked intently at the maid and said that he understood everything and they would soon come down. He looked at the princess intently and thanked her with a smile for calling him by name. A moment later, the young lady caught him by the sleeve and pulled him towards her. He froze in place because he didn't know what was going on at all. But a moment later, the princess said her name. He turned around in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady, in turn, said in embarrassment that her name was Osiria. She was shocked and did not understand what she should do in this situation. It seemed to her that human greed has no limits. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she was really asking him to call her by name. He sighed heavily and asked the princess for forgiveness. He said that it would be a little difficult. She was surprised, looked at him as she did not understand what he was talking about. He timidly asked her to understand him, and also said that he had forgotten something. A moment later, he began to show her the drawings and the people that were depicted on the paper. She froze in surprise, looking at the young man, because she did not understand why he refused. She wondered if this was some kind of problem. She was in shock. She did not understand why he refused her so abruptly. For a moment she was angry and told herself that she didn't really want to be called by her first name. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to eat. The young man sheepishly asked her for forgiveness and said that they had chatted too much. He smiled and said that they could go down to the dining room together. He said with a smile that next time he would draw a princess and even more different things. He looked at her intently and said that today, unfortunately, he did not have enough time and this is all he could draw. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect that he would draw for her himself. She looked at the young man intently and in surprise and asked if he had really drawn this. He said with a smile that it was so, because he thought that it would help her. The young lady, in turn, froze looking at the drawings, as she could not believe that he himself did all this because of her. She looked at him closely and wondered if everything he did for her could be summed up in one word: politeness. She understood that even expensive gemstones were not treated with such care. She understood perfectly well that in reality she was mired in the swamp and rotted along with it. She was puzzled because it all weighed on her, and she began to worry all the time. She was very afraid that one moment she would blink and suddenly find herself back in the attic. She was afraid that when her game was revealed, this concern would disappear. He looked at her intently and said that he would take her to the dining room immediately. Osiria looked at the young man and wondered until what point he would continue to speak and act with such affection. Some time later, they were already sitting in the dining room. The young lady looked in surprise at the beautiful, elegant table. She noticed that there was no rotten bread on the table, although this was obvious to her. She looked at the baby bib in surprise. She was a little surprised and puzzled, as she knew that she was not a child. He slowly cut the meat and looked sideways at the princess with a smile. He said that she was probably hungry and asked for forgiveness for making her wait. He smiled and told the princess that the food was hot, so she would have to wait a little. The young lady looked at the plate in surprise. She wondered if he had cut the meat she would eat. She knew perfectly well that this was not necessary, but she was still very surprised. He looked closely at the princess and a moment later handed her a piece of meat. He looked at the princess with a smile and told him that she needed to open her mouth. The young lady froze in shock. She realized that she was now experiencing déjà vu. She remembered how recently the maid had also fed her. She understood perfectly well that they needed to know the measure. With lightning speed, the princess took the fork with meat from him and began to eat on her own. The young man looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not expect this. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was sure that she could eat on her own. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that of course she could eat on her own, even though she was pretending, but she wanted to look unsightly in moderation. He looked closely at the princess and asked if she really would eat by herself. A moment later, the princess froze in place as she saw that he had drooped. She did not understand what was going on. She was surprised and did not understand why he was so disappointed. She understood only one thing, that the more she learned about him, the more she did not understand him. She looked at him with a smile and told him to eat as the food was very tasty. Fidelius looked at the princess intently and wished her a pleasant meal. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, as she was very tired. When she ate so much delicious food alone, she immediately thought of Aqua. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that her friend had left early in the morning, and there was still no news from her. She was a little worried, as it was the first time they had been apart for so long. She thought that even if Aqua returned late, it would happen at least in the evening. The young man looked at the princess intently, and in surprise, Osiria wondered if everything was okay with her. Previously, it seemed to her that Aqua was afraid of the king. She was shocked and did not understand what to do, and if the king harmed her, she was worried and afraid that something could happen, that Aqua would never return to her. A moment later, she began to cough violently. The young man looked at the princess with concern and asked if he was all right. She sighed heavily as she realized she had choked due to her excitement. A moment later, she froze in place, in shock, as she realized that the young man was patting her on the shoulder affectionately. He looked at her closely and quietly said that she should drink the water slowly and she would definitely feel better. He said that she should not be too scared. She sheepishly agreed with him. The young lady was a little surprised, as she had felt this during their first meeting, but his palms were incredibly strong and warm. She wondered if that was why she felt safe around him. He looked at the princess intently and said that she would sleep in his room for a while, and if she needed anything, she could tell him at any time. The young lady in turn was very sad, because even after eating, Aqua was nowhere to be seen. She was very worried, but a moment later she felt the presence of her friend. She was sure that she had just seen a blue light and turned around. She realized that her friend had returned to her. The young man looked at the princess in surprise and called her. In a hurry, the princess said that she would go to her room. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he had expected her to agree so quickly, but he did not answer. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she urgently needed to meet her friend and she needed a place to be alone with her. She looked at the young man intently and wondered if such persistence would not work on him. A moment later, the young man knelt before the princess and asked her to promise him that she would not come near the window. She looked at him in surprise as she remembered what had happened. She looked at the young man closely and wondered if he was still worried about that incident. The princess looked at the young man closely and said that she was convinced that she would not go to the window. A moment later, the young lady entered her room. In a hurry, she called out to Aqua, and a moment later she saw her. Aqua rushed towards the princess with lightning speed. The young lady, in turn, was very glad that her friend returned to her. She looked at Aqua intently and worriedly said that she was very late, as she had been waiting for her all day. Aqua, in turn, timidly asked her mistress for forgiveness. Aqua said that she still tried to return before nightfall. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that all this was not important now, and the main thing was that she still returned to her. She looked at Aqua intently and asked what she was doing with the king. Aqua sighed heavily and said that she was only talking to him, and he really likes to joke around, so he kept her for a long time. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she did not know whether it was true that the king she had seen recently liked to joke. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed that he knew that she was normal. Aqua looked at her mistress intently and said that the king knew everything, and it seemed to her that the king really wanted to meet her. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at the shark and said that the knight had told her about it, but she was confused and did not know what the reason was for his wanting to meet her. No matter how much she thought she couldn't understand, she understood perfectly well that all the power belonged to Aqua, and he had already met her. She understood perfectly well that after the meeting, he no longer needed to be interested in her. Aqua looked at her mistress and said that unfortunately the king did not tell her this. And besides, it is very difficult to understand the course of his thoughts. She looked at her mistress and asked, "Do you remember if this is the one how a few days ago her power suddenly disappeared?" She looked at the mistress intently and said that the king told her about what happened then. The young lady, in turn, was surprised. She asked Aqua if the king was directly related to this. Aqua looked at the princess with a smile and said that everything was correct. She said that earlier, it seemed to her that the king did not want to let the young lady out of his country. Osiria froze in place from shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at her friend and asked if when she created the wings with magic, the king destroyed them. She was puzzled and wondered if she tried to leave this country in the future, this would happen again. Aqua froze, looking at the princess, not knowing what to answer. The young lady was very angry. She knew that she could not leave it all alone, since she had only taken the first step towards her revenge. She wondered how much the king could interfere with her plans. She was completely sure that he was not a human, but a creature that Aqua would certainly obey. She understood perfectly well that she did not have time to decide whether to be afraid or not. She wanted to meet him immediately and talk about everything. She was a little puzzled and excited, as it still lingered in her memory, that feeling of being examined from head to toe. In such a short time, he guessed her biggest secret. She was confused because she knew that this man was watching her. He was manipulating Aqua and warning her through Aqua. She assumed that he would most likely smile brazenly with everything like that day. The young lady sighed heavily. She was puzzled, as she understood perfectly well that she was now in a very serious and unpleasant situation, since she knew nothing about the king. Osiria was surprised and wondered if his purpose was observation. Then why did he send her to Fidelius, and then he restricted her movement? The young lady sighed heavily and said to Aqua that if he interfered, they would not be able to leave this estate. She sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to take the next step in their revenge. Aqua thought for a moment, looking at her mistress. She said that everything would be fine as long as they didn't leave this place forever. She looked at her hostess intently and asked her how she felt about going out at night and returning before sunrise. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The young lady asked her friend, surprised and puzzled, if there was any difference. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily, as she remembered her own words, that she wanted to leave this place and never return here again. Osiria wondered if her words were the problem. She was in shock, as she understood that she had now become the king's pet. Aqua looked at her owner in surprise, and asked if she really didn't want to live here anyway. She looked at her friend with a smile, and said that unfortunately, everyone here interfered in her affairs and bothered her. She looked at her friend with a smile, and said that she always needed only her. She said that she would be only with her all her life. Aqua looked at her owner with a smile, and said that she also liked the idea. A moment later, looking at her mistress, she said that unfortunately she would not do that, since they say that people cannot live alone. The young lady in turn froze, looking at her friend, as she did not understand what she was talking about. She asked timidly and puzzledly what Aqua was talking about. She asked her friend if she would always be there for her. A moment later they heard a noise. Fidelius informed the princess that he had come to see her. A moment later he knocked on the door and said that unfortunately he was a little late. The young lady froze in surprise. A moment later the young man entered the princess's bedroom. The young lady froze in place, as she only just managed to hide her friend. He looked at the princess in surprise, as she sat quietly on the bed. He asked in surprise if she was still awake. The young lady turned around and saw the young man in all his glory. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was so clinging to her. She looked at him sideways because she didn't understand why he was dressed like that. He looked at the young lady intently and asked for forgiveness for what happened earlier. He said that he never thought that she would want to sleep in her room. The young lady looked at him timidly, with a smile on her face. She sighed heavily and looked sideways at him, as she had a bad feeling. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really going to sleep here. He sighed heavily and said that she could ignore him, since he would also fall asleep after she fell asleep. The young lady, in turn, was very much alarmed. She knew that the matter was not in a dream at all. She simply had business that night. The young man slowly approached the princess and gently said that he would only stay with her until she fell asleep and wake her up in the morning. He asked her with a smile to fall asleep quickly while he wrapped her in a blanket. The young lady stood there in bewilderment, looking at the young man. She looked closely at his soft smile, as she understood that her friend was right, and this was a very good place for her future life. But unfortunately, she found it all very strange, since she was constantly shown kindness. She thought for a moment and wondered if it was possible that such warmth would be natural for her too. The young man looked intently at the young lady, who was already falling asleep. He wished her good night with a smile. Aqua slowly crawled up to her owner and began calling her. The young lady looked at her friend in confusion. Aqua told her mistress to quickly wake up and get up, as the human man had finally fallen asleep. Aqua looked at the young lady intently and said that if she was going to the Empire, then they needed to leave right now and couldn't stay any longer. After hearing her friend's words, the young lady woke up completely. She timidly apologized to her friend, as she had fallen asleep for a while. Aqua told her owner that everything was fine for now, but they needed to hurry. The young lady in turn said that she understood everything and began. A moment later, the young lady looked at her friend and timidly said that they seemed to have missed something. Aqua looked at her mistress in confusion, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The young lady looked timidly at her friend and, looking at the young man, asked her if they could get out unnoticed since he was sleeping on the ground. The lady looked closely at the knight, who was sleeping quietly. She wanted to pass unnoticed so as not to wake him. A moment later she heard him make a long drawn-out sound, and she winced worried that he might wake up at any moment. She was puzzled because she knew that this was a big problem. She understood perfectly well that she needed to observe the people from the Empire, but she didn't know how to do it. Aqua looked closely at the owner and with a smile told her not to worry too much. Aqua said with a smile that she had a solution to any problem. She told her owner to believe her and follow her. Sometime later, the young lady and her friend were already hovering over the water's surface. The young lady stood frozen, looking at the pond, as she knew it was a very beautiful sight. She had no idea that there was such a beautiful pond in her backyard. Aqua looked at her mistress and said with a smile that she seemed to have already gotten the hang of flying. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile and asked if she thought so too. Osiris looked at her friend intently, as she understood perfectly well that she was capable of anything. And it had always been that way. She was surprised as Aqua, with her small hands, created a thin curtain of water around Fidelius, and thanks to him, they were able to easily and quietly get out of the room. She looked closely at her friend and asked worriedly if there would definitely be no problems. Aqua, with a proud smile on her face, and said that of course everything would be fine, and if they were not too late, everything would be fine, and this curtain would hide even the quietest sounds. She looked at her friend intently and said that they needed to get back before the young man woke up. But she was taken aback for a moment because it seemed to her that this water was connected to some place. For some reason, she had the feeling that the water was tightly sealed. Aqua said with a smile that everything was correct, because the pond was an artificial body of water dug by people. She said with a smile that they would still find their way through it. The young lady froze as she enjoyed the beautiful sight. She had never seen anything like it before. She stood still for a moment as she was fascinated by the blue light from the pond. Aqua looked at her mistress with a smile and called. Her Aqua smiled as she looked at her mistress and said that she should jump into the depths of the pond. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked closely at Aqua and said anxiously that her explanation was not enough, as she was afraid to jump unexpectedly into a pond of water. She looked closely at the pond, as it looked much deeper than her bathtub, but she was surprised, as she did not feel any fear at all. Something just attracted her. A moment later, she finally made up her mind and jumped into the lake. She knew that everything would be okay, as she trusted her friend. With lightning speed, she dived into one lake. She was surprised because she was diving into this one. She thought that it would be cold there and that she would start to lose her breath. But fortunately, everything was the opposite. Aqua swam up to her owner with a smile and asked if this was all surprising. She looked closely at her mistress and said with a smile that she could breathe and even talk while underwater. The young lady, in turn, was surprised as she did not expect such a thing. Aqua said with a smile that her mistress was just great, but now she would have to jump again. She used her magic, and her Naledi noticed a new glow ahead of her. The young lady said that she would believe her and jump immediately. A moment later, the young lady froze and looked at her wrists in surprise, as she did not understand what they were. Some time later, the young lady found herself on the surface. She was surprised because her view had changed. She looked around in surprise and, looking at her friend, asked where they had ended up. But a moment later, the young lady sighed heavily and said that she thought she knew where they were. She saw a deserted land. She noticed the thick air which had no moisture at all. She realized that they were now in the Empire. Aqua looked at Osiria with a smile and said that they were in the village of Richel, which was very close to the capital of Trump. Aqua said that there was no longer a full body of water anywhere else in the Empire. The young lady, in turn, looked at the water. She knew it would be more correct to call it a puddle, not water. A moment later, she called out to her friend. The young lady looked closely at her hands and said that just before she fell into the hole, she had this on her wrists. She looked closely at her wrists and said that this was the first time she had seen such magic. She said that these circles felt like water. She looked at her friend closely and asked if she did it. Aqua looked at her owner confused and said that it wasn't her. Aqua looked at the young lady closely and said that she thought it would be better if they hurried. She said that, unfortunately, they didn't have much time, so they should quickly do what needed to be done and return. The young lady thought for a moment, as she realized whose handiwork this was. This magic seemed unusual to her. Now Osiria was sure that it was created by the king. Osiris, in turn, realized that she needed to be on guard and keep an eye on the king and Fidelius. She glanced sideways at her friend and said that they needed to hurry, since she didn't want to linger in this disgusting place either. The young lady knew full well that she would have her fill of ridicule at him and at the sight of an empire that would soon be destroyed. Sometime later, she was walking around the outskirts of the village. The young lady glanced sideways at the fruit counters. She thought that the same kind of fruit Mary had given her was on display, but she noticed that they were a completely different size. Osiria understood that not only the fruits, but also the expressions on the faces of all the people were the same, dark and exhausted. While walking down the street, she accidentally collided with someone. She screamed in pain. The man fell to the ground with a thud. The young lady rushed to him and asked for forgiveness. She asked if he could get up. She froze in shock as she saw the exhausted look of the man. Aqua sighed heavily and told her mistress to leave the man and go quickly, as he would soon die anyway. Aqua looked at the man closely and said that he was barely breathing, so tonight would probably be his last night. The young lady, in turn, was shocked, as she did not understand why he would die tonight. She was shocked and wondered why no one cared. It was all foreign to her. A moment later, she froze in shock as she saw a man crawling on the ground, shaking and asking for water. The young lady looked at her friend and asked in confusion if there had once been a river here. Aqua said that from a village located a little further north, a river flowed here. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why the man was looking for water here instead of going to the river. Aqua said that the young lady would understand it when they got there. Now she understood why her heart had been ready to jump out of her chest for some time. She wondered if it was because of the irritating and unpleasant air. Sometime later, they arrived at the place. The young lady froze in place from shock. She shuddered and felt uneasy. Aqua sighed heavily and said that if all the surroundings of the river were like this, it would be very difficult to get into the water. The young lady, in turn, was shocked, as it was the first time she had seen something like this. She thought for a moment, and looking at everything that was happening, she said that it looked like a living hell. The young lady looked at the young people in bewilderment. She was puzzled and did not understand what they were going to do. But a moment later, fire burst into flames before her eyes. She froze in shock. The man shouted to his subordinates not to miss a single person, as they needed to burn them all. The young lady froze in place as she suddenly saw before her eyes the image of her own mother being taken away from her life. They were chanting like hotels for her to be executed as quickly as possible. Aqua looked at her mistress, who sat with tears in her eyes. She said that all people would die anyway, and she didn't need to be sad about someone's death. Osiris couldn't take the weight any longer. She fell to the ground with a bang. Aqua rushed to her mistress in a hurry. She was very worried about her. The young lady, in turn, was breathing heavily. She felt very bad. She knew that Aqua had told her earlier that the death of her mother and the death of people was natural, but she did not understand why her heart was breaking so much from the sight of all this. Aqua looked at the young lady closely and told her to calm down, as she was about to tell her some news that would make her happy. She said that very soon, the water from this river would no longer be usable. Aqua said that it meant that no matter what method people used, they would destroy themselves. The young lady looked at her friend intently. She didn't understand what she was talking about, and it seemed to her that she didn't know something. A moment later, the young lady shuddered. She looked at her friend and hastily said that the bracelet was very hot. Aqua looked intently at her mistress and said that she had completely forgotten about it. Aqua said that it seemed like the time limit would end soon, and they needed to head back quickly. She looked at her mistress intently and said that the king might be angry. The young lady, in turn, froze in place, not knowing what to do. She was puzzled since the hot air reached even her. She was sure that people were still alive, and she heard a scream. She looked into the distance and wondered if she were to rain heavily on this place, would the people be able to survive? Aqua looked closely at her mistress and said that she was in a hurry. Aqua was excited and told her owner to quickly take her hand. The young lady in turn realized that all those people were just losing their lives because of their weakness. She told herself that this did not apply to her at all. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in the lake. They returned back to the estate with lightning speed. Aqua looked at her mistress with a worried expression and asked if she was in any pain. She wanted to know if her mistress was okay. The young lady was silent for a moment, but a moment later she said that she was fine, just a little tired. Osiria looked at her friend intently and said that it was time for them to return. Before Fidelius woke up, the young man in turn slept quietly, suspecting nothing. Sometime later, the young lady and her friend flew up to the window. Osiria looked at Aqua intently and told her to be quiet as they needed to get inside quietly. Sometime later, the young lady quietly came down and slowly closed the window, but it creaked quietly. She looked back and stared at the young man who was sleeping quietly. The young lady was very glad because she saw that the young man had been sleeping and had not woken up while they were gone. She slowly walked closer to him and looked at him intently as she saw that this time he was sleeping on the floor. She was surprised and did not understand why he was behaving like this. She knew that this place was his home, and it was he who had to live with her because of her circumstances. She wondered if in that case, shouldn't she sleep on the floor? She sighed heavily as she couldn't understand this man at all. The young lady slowly climbed into her bed, but a moment later she flinched as she heard him calling her, and she froze sitting on the bed. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she woke up so late. He asked if she really needed something. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand from what moment he had not slept. She looked closely at the young man and wondered if he had seen her fly through the window. Fidelius slowly walked up to the young lady and carefully covered her with a blanket. He said that there was still a lot of time until the morning, so she could sleep longer. The young lady froze in surprise. A moment later, looking at the young man, she wished him good night. He smiled and wished her good dreams. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt relieved as she realized that he seemed not to suspect anything. But in turn, she was a little puzzled, as it seemed to her that the lies were only accumulating. The young lady worriedly asked Aqua if there was anything bad that she had done today. Aqua thought for a moment and said that it was not. The young lady in turn understood that she had done nothing of the sort, since they all had nothing to do with her, and she had no need to think about people at all. She understood perfectly well that she had more important things to do. The young lady slowly fell asleep, as she was very tired. After a while she froze in shock and looked closely at her hand, as she did not see the sign. She froze with surprise on her face and called her friend. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was having the same dream again. It was a completely black world in which she found herself without her friend. The young lady took a deep breath. She knew that today she had to go through this. A moment later she saw her mother in the distance, who was pregnant. Looking at her mother, who was smiling tenderly, she felt sad. This dream reminded her of the past. Sometimes she thought that it would only show the scene of her mother's murder, but from time to time, she returned to the more distant past. The woman with a smile on her face gently stroked her belly and told her daughter that earlier when she was very little, she traveled around one North Island. She looked closely at her mother, whose face looked happy, even though the blood of the man she hated so much flowed through her. With great love, her mother told her stories every night. The stories were from her life as a nomad. She told of a long journey around the world. The child in her belly could not even understand her words, but she did not miss a day of this ritual. The lady looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and asked her to throw the child away and run away. She screamed for her mother not to sit idly by, for she had to know what would happen to her in the future. A moment later, her sleep was interrupted. The image of her mother disappeared. Osiria froze in place, not understanding what was happening. A moment later, she heard a very loud scream, and turning around, she saw a terrible flame, and in it, the head of her mother. The lady shuddered. She moved away from the fire but still continued to hear the scream. Hands reached out to the young lady from the fire. She screamed and asked them to let her go, but they kept asking her for water. She was in shock and did not want to see such dreams anymore. Fidelia shook the young lady. He wanted to wake her up. He was agitated but looked at her and asked if she could hear him. The young lady in turn pulled herself closer to the young man and called him by name. He froze in bewilderment looking at the princess. She, in turn, understood perfectly well that everything was fine with her and it was just a dream. She only glanced at the past, reflected in the mirror surface of the water. She knew that her heart could not hurt anymore. For some time, the young man quietly and tenderly hugged the princess until she calmed down. He looked at her closely and asked if she was okay, as it seemed she had had a nightmare. A moment later, he froze in shock and raised her hand. He asked where she was hurt. The young lady froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her wounded hand with a worried expression and said that there were no trees nearby. She froze, not knowing what to answer. The young man sighed heavily. The young lady, in turn, froze, not knowing what to do. A moment later, he said that he would first bring the medicine, and later he would call the maid, and she should wait a little. The young lady stared after him. She was irritated and had a feeling that something was wrong. Osiria wondered if the problem was her short visit to the empire. The maid rushed to the princess with lightning speed. She was excited and did not understand where the princess could have been so badly hurt. She looked at the princess in surprise and excitement and asked what happened last night. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. She understood that she was finished. Osiria looked closely at the young man. She was irritated. Her head hurt from the maid. She understood that we could have resolved everything quietly. She did not understand at all why he called the maid. Mary was excited and asked the princess about everything. She could not believe that the princess was so badly hurt. She looked at her wounded hand and asked where she was so hurt, since the cut was deep. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the maid, as she seemed to her to be a very surprising person, as she reacted very sharply if someone was injured. The young man looked closely at the maid and told her that he understood her perfectly well, that she was very frightened, but he would take care of the treatment himself. He asked her to step aside. The young lady froze in surprise, feeling as if she was always to blame for everything. She understood perfectly well that she herself was sick, but she did not understand why she felt guilty about it. The maid looked at the princess intently, and with a smile told her to look at the beautiful toy that she would now receive. The maid, with a smile, said that if the princess endured the treatment, she would give her the toy. The young lady, in her turn, was puzzled. She did not understand how long they were going to treat her like a child. The young man looked at her sideways and told her to give him her hand. The young lady slowly extended her hand to him and shuddered when he touched it. Fidelius, after finishing the treatment, he looked at the young lady closely and asked if she went anywhere. Last night, the princess froze in shock as she didn't know what to answer. Her heart was beating very fast, and she was taken aback and said that she had not gone anywhere. He looked at her intently and asked if it was true. The young lady froze, not knowing what to answer. She did not understand why he was asking her such questions. She understood perfectly well that if he continued to talk about such things, then she would tell him everything. She knew that this could not be allowed. A moment later, the young lady rushed to her maid and grabbed her hand. The maid was taken aback as she was in shock. The young man looked at the princess in surprise and called her. A moment later, he sighed heavily and asked her for forgiveness. But a moment later, he said that it was time for him to go to the palace, so he would leave them. The young lady sighed heavily. She realized that on the first day when she came to his estate, she noticed that he was very patient. As she watched him go, she thought that perhaps he would soon reach his limit. The young man slowly left the young lady's room. He sighed heavily, as he could not understand anything at all. He knew perfectly well that this wound could not have been received inside the room. He knew that until yesterday, she had been fine, and there were no visible signs of violence. He thought back to last night and wondered for a moment if perhaps she'd not just woken up while sleeping, but rather had been climbing into bed. He wondered if she had returned to the room after going outside. He was surprised and couldn't understand how it happened, as he knew that he was a light sleeper, so he couldn't help but notice her leaving. But what worried him even more was that look accustomed to pain. He knew that it was not such a small wound that could be ignored. His head was splitting from such thoughts, but unfortunately, he could not understand what was happening to the princess at all. The young man froze in surprise, looking at the king as he looked exhausted. He looked closely at the king and asked excitedly if he had slept well the previous night. The king said in confusion that unfortunately he could not sleep at all because something had happened that had upset him very much. The young man looked at the king in bewilderment because he did not understand what he was talking about. The king looked at his friend and said that there was actually one wild animal on a leash, which he had entrusted to a trusted zookeeper, but unfortunately yesterday, this animal had escaped from its cage and had caused mischief. The young man looked at the king in bewilderment. He did not understand what wild animal they were talking about. The king sighed heavily and said that the situation was now more serious than he had imagined. Fidelius knew perfectly well that there were no animals in this kingdom that could be called wild, so there was a high probability that this was one of the king's jokes. The king looked at the young man intently and asked how the princess was doing. He looked at the king in surprise, as he did not expect such a question. A moment later, he said that she had received a strange wound during the night. The king looked at the young man with a smile and said that he still thought he should meet the princess. He asked his friend to bring her tomorrow. Fidelius looked at the king in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing. The king looked at his friend with a grin and said that he had lost, so he must fulfill his part of the deal. The king looked at his friend with a smirk on his face and asked if he was really going to take his words back. The young man clenched his fists in anger and, gritting his teeth, said that he would obey the king's order. Some time later, the young man was sitting with the king drinking tea. The king looked at his friend with a grin and asked if he was really going to paint pictures for the princess today. He looked at the king intently and said that this was so because the princess understood words much faster than he had supposed, so he wanted to teach her them. The king said with a smile that he was very glad that his son was trying so hard for Her Highness. He looked at the king intently and told him to be careful with his addresses. The king looked at him with an innocent smile. The king looked at his friend with a radiant smile and asked if he had said anything wrong. He smiled and said that he was the king of this country, and all its subjects were like children to him. The king looked at him with a smile and asked if he thought that he too was becoming his son. The young man was shocked by such a statement. Fidelius understood perfectly well that the king was joking. He did so at every opportunity and did not even say anything about important topics. He looked at the king intently and asked if the princess had any hidden power. He said that no matter how much he thought about it, it seemed very strange to him that he had not even noticed her going out at night. He sighed heavily, as he didn't know what was really going on. The king looked at the young man with a smile, but did not answer him. Fidelius looked at the king intently, and as he left, said that today was the day of training for the Knights Company, so he had to leave. The king looked at Fidelius in surprise and said that such matters could be entrusted to a deputy. Fidelius, leaving, said that he could not do this every time. Fidelius looked at the king and said that since he could not be near him, he would immediately call Her Excellency Prime Minister Helena to the king. The king was shocked. He grabbed Fidelius by the clothes with lightning speed and asked him in confusion why he called her in particular. Fidelius looked sideways at the king with a smirk on his face, as he now understood everything from the king's reaction. Fidelius looked at the king and said that it was time for him to leave. The king looked at his knight in surprise and shouted at him the king wanted him not to leave. The king looked at the knight with puzzlement and asked if he thought he was acting too treacherous. Fidelius bowed low and thanked the king for gladly letting him go. He said that in that case he would return after dinner. The king was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing from his loyal knight. He shouted after him and asked if he really thanked him so much after he carefully raised Fidelius. With the ascension of the current king to the throne, the methods of entry into the royal palace have changed greatly. If previously only those with suitable heredity or connections could enter, now there is an admission system for all those who have passed the exam, regardless of their origin. Gender, age, and rank were not important. Only skills were taken into account. The first one to enter, after passing such a selection, was the current Prime Minister, Madame Elena, and she is also the person the king does not like to deal with. The king was shocked and screamed at his friend, as he could not believe that he had betrayed him like that. Fidelius sighed heavily. He did not understand why he did not love the sorceress so much. The sorceress approached the young man and called him in surprise. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to see her. He looked at her intently and asked why she was here. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that these dry addresses could be discarded. She looked at Fidelius intently and asked if His Majesty was in his office. Fidelius looked at the sorceress intently and said that the king was just about to call her. She froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her closely and realized that she had reasons why she came to the king so soon. He looked at her closely and asked if there was really a lot of work to do. She sighed heavily and said that it was obvious and not just a lot. She said that she heard that he was taking care of the princess of the empire. She looked intently at the young man and asked how she was. He froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. For a moment he wondered what the princess was really like. He knew that she was sincere, kind, and smiled very often. A few days ago she drank water herself without their help, and for him this was already a big progress. He looked into the distance with a soft smile and said that she really was an incredible person. The young lady in turn froze in place, as she was surprised by such an expression on the young man's face. She had never seen him speak about someone with such a soft smile before. She looked at him intently and asked if that was really the case. He looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with her face. He asked if there was any problem. The young lady was taken aback and said that that was not the case at all. She looked at him intently and wondered if he was a complete fool. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why she was acting like that. She looked at him intently and said that she would take the king into her care for a while, so he could concentrate on military matters. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be time to get ready a little. She looked intently at the young man and said that it was time for her to go. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was sure she could handle it, since he knew that His Majesty was not in the best mood today. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that he would certainly cope with the king. She turned around and looked at him with a smile. She said that she alone was enough, since this was not the first time this had happened. She looked at him with a smile and told him not to worry and to go about his business. She said that he need not worry, since His Majesty would not be able to leave the office until they had finished all the work. Fidelius respected the young lady, and he could say with certainty that the young mistress was the only person in this kingdom who was capable of keeping the king in her hands. The young lady looked closely at the toy she had received from the maid. She saw that the toy was very shabby and looked completely useless. Aqua looked closely at her mistress and asked with a smile if she was tired. The princess sighed heavily and said that fortunately she was not. She looked closely at her friend and said that she thought she would have to keep a close eye on him when she decided to go outside. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the man was very smart. Puzzled because he had noticed her wound, she couldn't find her place. She in turn hoped that he hadn't thought of something strange. The young lady looked at her friend and said that she was interested in something. Aqua looked at her hostess with a smile and said that she could ask any questions. Osiria told her friend that she wanted to talk about the river they saw when they went to the Empire. She looked at her friend and said that then she said that they could no longer use the water from that river. Aqua looked at her mistress and said that it was all because of the poison. She said that over time, human corpses become poison. She looked closely at the owner and said that if they were left near the river, the poison would get into the water through the ground, and the water would become polluted. The young lady, in turn, was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she realized that this was all happening because of the poison. She knew it made sense. She knew they were really cruel. And the scene she saw made her dizzy. She was confused and didn't know how many people those people had burned. But she knew perfectly well that it wasn't the first time she thought they had set fire to corpses. Many more times. Aqua looked at her mistress intently and said that it was obvious what would happen after prolonged consumption of such water. She said that unfortunately, it had a very bad effect on the human nervous system. She sighed heavily and said that when it gets dirty, the victim will begin to suffer. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and shock. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and wondered what would happen if all those people could drink plenty of clean water. A moment later, she was taken aback as the maid walked into the princess's room with a smile and said that she had brought her some food. She thought that the princess was hungry. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock and stared at her friend as she did not expect the maid to come to her so suddenly. The maid, in turn, froze in place, looking at the princess. A moment later, she looked at the princess with a smile and said that she seemed to like the toy she had given her very much. Mary told the princess with a smile that she was very worried that she would be unhappy with such a gift. The princess, in turn, nervously hugged the toy. She hoped that the maid did not notice anything. She sighed heavily, as the maid had frightened her very much with her sudden arrival. The maid approached the princess with a smile and asked if she would lend her the toy for a while. Mary greeted the princess with a smile on behalf of the rabbit. She said with a smile on her face that she came there because she liked the princess. She looked at the princess intently, and in the name of the rabbit, asked her to hug her tighter. The young lady, in turn, was surprised and about the task, but looked at the maid as she saw that she had taken up her task again. Osiria sighed heavily. She was very tense and did not understand how long she had to play, along with such childish jokes, but in turn she agreed with a smile. Mary looked at the princess with a smile on her face as she was happy. A moment later, she looked at the princess with a radiant smile and said that she actually made it herself. Mary smiled and told the princess that it was a gift from her. The maid timidly said that the toy was not very firm because it was the first time she had made something like that. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She asked herself if Mary had made the toy especially for her. A moment later, she saw her pricked fingers. For a moment, the princess was sad, as it was the first time in her life that she had received a gift. A moment later, she tenderly stroked the maid's head and praised her. Mary froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady, in turn, knew that her friend liked it when she did this. The maid thanked the princess with a smile. She looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she was very happy because the princess thanked and praised her. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock and embarrassment because she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at her maid and wondered how she could smile like that without a single doubt. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, for she knew that Mary was very different from her. She thought that Mary had probably lived her whole life without knowing what darkness was. Sometime later, Mary became alert as she heard that the owner had returned. Mary rose to leave with a smile. She turned around and told the young lady that she would come to see her before she went to bed. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise, but a moment later the young man entered her bedroom. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what kind of bundle of papers he had in his hands. He looked closely at the princess and asked for forgiveness, as he was a little late. The young lady, in turn, looked at him in surprise, as he mentioned paint pens, paper, and brushes. She knew that such a set was used during painting. He smiled and said that he decided that she might be bored, just sitting in the manor, and so he bought all this and brought it to her. The young lady looked at all the items he brought in surprise. She thought for a moment, as she had never tried drawing before. For a moment she thought that this could be a lot of fun. He looked closely at the young lady who was enjoying the little things. The young man told the princess that if she came closer to him, he would tell her how to draw properly. He looked at the princess intently and said that before all this, he should ask something more intelligently. Fidelius looked at the princess intently and asked if she would go with him to the royal palace tomorrow. The young lady froze for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that His Majesty wished to meet her. Osiria stood frozen for a moment. She knew he wished he hadn't seen her. She thought it had something to do with what had happened yesterday. She knew he most likely knew she was leaving the kingdom of her own free will. She knew very well that if it were possible, she would not want to meet him. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not need to worry too much. The young lady froze for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that he would go with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he would really go with her. He said with a soft smile that it was exactly like that. Osiria, in turn, was very happy about this. He looked at her intently and thanked her. The young lady, in turn, responded with an approving smile. She, in turn, understood perfectly well that unfortunately she did not know what was behind the wheel, but she could not run away from him. She knew perfectly well that she would have to face this. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she was drawing for the first time, so she would be better off using colored pencils rather than paints. The young man slowly placed a sheet of clean paper in front of her. For a moment she froze, as it was the first time in her life that she had seen such beautiful and snow-white paper. He looked at her closely and said that the main tool with which one can draw on such a sheet is a pencil. The young man slowly began to show her how to correctly take a pencil in her hand. He said that after she takes it, she will need to try to draw one line to the side. He slowly began to show everything. The young lady, in turn, looked at him intently and thought that it was very simple. She knew that this time she would not pretend and would show her real abilities. A moment later, she took the pencil firmly in her hand and began to draw as he showed her, but unfortunately something went wrong. She looked at the ruined sheet of paper. In surprise, she did not understand why she was drawing so badly. He looked at the young lady and said that this would be enough. The young lady, in turn, was shocked. She did not understand what he was talking about. She was puzzled because what she had drawn was completely different from what he had. He looked at the princess with a smile and said that if she drew straight lines, she would be able to draw a detailed box. He slowly began to explain to her how and what to do. The young lady was shocked because he drew a beautiful picture. She, in turn, understood perfectly well that it was not difficult. She saw how he did everything very easily and naturally. She understood perfectly well that if she drew without cutting along one line, then she would certainly succeed. She wanted to prove to him that this time she would succeed. The young man, in turn, froze in shock. She was perplexed and did not understand why she was not succeeding. He looked closely at the princess and said that drawing required creativity and reinterpretation. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at her drawing. After all that had been said, she looked at him intently and said that his drawing was this box. She asked what her drawing meant. The young man, in turn, froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Looking at the princess, he said that in this drawing, what is incredible is that she used a technique that even he can do. The young lady froze in shock. She realized that in the end, he was saying that her drawing was strange. She understood perfectly well that if she really drew well, then he would have said so. Osiria was shocked since she was not even a small child, but was not able to draw one straight line. The young lady, in turn, was very puzzled by this creativity. She slowly put aside all the drawing instruments and headed towards the bed. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really not interested in drawing. Osiris thought about how it was the first time in her life that she held a pencil in her hands, and how terribly she drew. She was terribly ashamed of herself. She understood perfectly well that she had been sitting in a cold and dark attic all her life, and in that place, all she could do was resist the darkness. She was perplexed and did not understand why she even pretended to be a child. Fidelius looked intently at the princess, with bewilderment on his face. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she was a real fool even without any pretense. Fidelius looked at the princess intently, and with a gentle smile, asked her not to be sad because her lines were crooked, and the shape of her cube was not a success. He looked at her intently and said that he liked absolutely everything that was drawn by her. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and asked if it was true. Fidelius looked at the princess with a radiant and gentle smile and said that this was the pure truth. Osiris thought that the young man was being honest with her, and so this comforted her. She didn't want to admit it, but now she understood that they were good people. She understood perfectly well now that they were washing her from the darkness in which she was mired. The young lady was taken aback for a moment. She thought that everything would be fine if she met them a little later, after she took her revenge. The maid was excited and looked at the princess intently. She asked her to get up and not to resist, since today the princess had to meet the king. The maid asked the princess not to forget that she needed to come to her senses as soon as possible. The princess, in turn, made drawn-out sounds and did not answer. She sighed heavily, as she was very tired, because she had thought a lot about everything yesterday, and for this reason had fallen asleep late. She looked at the maid and said that she wanted to sleep a little longer. Mary sighed heavily, looking at the princess, and said that this could not be done. She told the princess that she would certainly help her wash herself, so she should come to her senses as soon as possible. Some time later, the young lady was ready to meet the king. She looked at her reflection intently, and in surprise, Osiris froze, looking into the mirror because she understood that her servant really did not only dolls, but also did everything well in general. Turning around, she saw her maid, who was looking at her creation with a smile. Mary looked at the princess with a smile on her face and said that she was very beautiful today. She did not understand how the princess could be so nice. The young lady, in turn, decided to pretend that she did not hear anything. As she walked outside, she saw her friend. She froze for a moment and wondered how long he had been waiting for her. She felt very sorry, and for a moment she thought that she shouldn't have been so late. Coming closer to him, she saw a beautiful carriage and froze for a moment. He turned around and called the princess. She looked at him puzzled and wondered if she would really ride in a carriage again. The young lady was well aware that this was a big problem, because just looking at the carriage made her feel like she was about to vomit. She knew perfectly well that it was all because of the unpleasant first experience. While she was traveling to the kingdom, she was seasick many times, but if it weren't for the impossible schedule and the services with their excessive care, then it wouldn't have been so hard for her. She was very much puzzled and did not know what to do, as she was still not sure that she would be able to ride it. He looked at her closely and said he was sure it was too much for her. He looked at the princess with a smile and said she didn't have to force herself to ride in the carriage. He said it was too long a walk, unfortunately, and asked if she would be all right. Fidelius looked at the princess intently and asked if she wanted to ride a horse. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect him to say something like that. But a moment later she was very glad, for there were other ways. She was glad that she would no longer have to ride in a carriage. The young man leaned unsuccessfully toward the princess and quietly asked if she really liked the horses more than him. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback by the indignation. She looked intently at the young knight as he suddenly asked her a strange question. She thought it would be better if she walked, but unfortunately, it was too long. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that she liked the horse. The young man sighed heavily and said that in that case they would go on it. She looked away from him for a moment, for some reason feeling awkward, answering that she liked him. The young man looked at the princess intently and said that she needed to mount her horse. She looked at him in surprise as she did not know what to do. But a moment later, with the speed of lightning, the young knight picked up the princess and sat her on a horse. Osiria was in shock, as everything happened very quickly. The young lady in turn unconsciously pressed herself against the knight, as it was very high, and she was frightened. She slowly stroked the horse's mane. Although she had seen them with the help of her friend, it was the first time she had ridden on the horse's back herself. She glanced sideways at her friend and asked him to go faster. Fidelius looked at her in surprise, asked what she was talking about. The young lady in turn asked him if it was possible to go faster. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she wasn't scared. She said with a smile that she wasn't scared at all and that she liked it faster. She looked ahead with a radiant smile, although she was uncomfortable because of the shaking. But thanks to the fact that he held her tightly in his arms, she felt safe. When Osiria rode her horse, she felt as if she was flying in the sky. Sometime later, they finally arrived at the royal castle. Standing outside the door, the young man told the king that he had come to him and had brought the princess with him. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as they finally arrived at the castle. She looked closely at the door as she understood that the king was behind it. After a while, the king said they could come. Osiria slowly walked into the room and froze at the beauty of the interior. She looked around for the king, since she didn't see him anywhere. A moment later, the king looked at her intently and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He looked at her closely and asked with a smirk how she was living in this place. He wanted to know if she had any problems. Osiria, in turn, froze, and her heart began to beat very hard from his smirk on his face. She looked at the king intently and in surprise, wondering if this was really the same man she had seen before. For a moment, she hesitated as the atmosphere was too different from that time. Fidelius leaned over slowly and told the princess that the king was now standing before her, the man for whom she had come to the kingdom. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She knew everything perfectly well without his prompting. The king in turn looked intently at the young lady with a grin on his face, but did not answer. The king looked at his knight and said that he had become bold to leave him yesterday. Fidelius looked at the king and said that the prime minister had said that she would take care of him for a while and help him focus on military matters. The king looked at him with a grin and said that he had heard it. He looked closely at the knight and told him to do as she told him. A moment later, the king told him that he could go free. The young man looked at the king in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The king in turn said that he and the princess needed to talk about something in private. The king looked at the young man intently and said that when the prime minister came, he would ask him to take the princess to him. He asked him to take care of the knightly company for the time being, of which he had spoken yesterday. Fidelius began to protest and object, but all was in vain. The king looked at the young man intently and gave him a cold look. In all seriousness and in a threatening tone, he told the knight to leave the room immediately. The young lady in turn froze, and her heart began to beat very hard. She was afraid of such an aura of the king. She felt it before, but in his voice there is a power that cannot be resisted and opposed. She understood perfectly well that although the king did not insist, the knight had no choice but to obey the order. The young man reluctantly told the king that he understood him and would do everything. The king looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she could sit down as they were going to have a serious conversation. He looked at her intently and asked how long she intended to keep her mouth shut. The young lady in turn looked at him intently but said nothing. He looked at the princess with a smile and asked if she liked Fidelius's house. He wanted to know if she was comfortable living there. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to ask him a question. She asked in surprise why he had assigned such a kind fool to her. The king froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, he looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that it was true. since people like Fidelius were rare. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he had singled out a person he valued very much for her, so she should treat him well. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She clenched her fists in anger and said that the young man was very skillful and capable. She looked at the king intently and said that no matter what she did, he was shaking with fear and forbade her to do anything dangerous. Osiria said that even though she pretended she was still old enough, but he treated her like a little child. The king looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and asked if this was the reason she was unhappy. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that, of course, this was so since he had a lot of work here, and she was becoming a hindrance to him. She understood that he never left her alone. For this reason, she had to sneak out or eat at night. She did not help him in any way, but only added a lot of work for him. She looked at the king intently and, sighing heavily, said that she was very sorry for the young man and for the way she had deceived him. She was very puzzled because she knew that she had nothing to repay for the warmth he gave her. So if you receive something that you cannot repay, for then in the end, the relationship will become nothing more than a burden, both for her and for the young man. The king looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what was wrong with deception. He looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that if she ever decided to tell him everything herself in the future, she could simply bow her head and ask for forgiveness. She looked at the king with surprise and bewilderment and said that this would not at all lighten her duty to him. The king looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at the king intently and said that if you do not return what you have received, it becomes a debt. The king sighed heavily and wondered what they should do in this situation. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if he understood correctly that she herself said that she would stay in that country for the sake of revenge. The young lady shuddered, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to isolate that entire country. She froze in shock as she couldn't believe it. She now understood perfectly well that he knew about everything she had said to Irina. She wondered if it could really be that he had been watching everything through the water. She looked closely at the king, as she knew perfectly well that she must not worry, as she had already predicted this outcome. Osiria was surprised, looked at the king, and asked why he was interested in such a thing, since it was in no way connected with the kingdom. The king sighed heavily and said that many people would die. He said that he thought she also knew how sad it was when people died from lack of water. He looked at her intently and asked if she didn't understand anything. Even after watching the spectacle that unfolded in the empire, the young lady froze in place, looking at the king. She was puzzled and did not know what answer he expected from her. She wondered if her feelings would be softened by sympathy. She looked at the king intently and said that she did not understand what he was talking about. She said that if he was talking now about that terrible country that she had observed in the village, then she had returned because of the asset's words that they would die even if nothing was done. The king sighed heavily and said that human death was harder than it might seem at first glance. He said that he was asking her now if she could bear this weight. The young lady sighed heavily and drooped. She did not answer this question. A moment later, the king said that, if you think about it, this spirit that was always with her had corrupted her. The young lady, in turn, looked at the king with rage. She did not understand what he was talking about. The king looked at her intently and said that he had sent his child to her only because he thought that it had the most necessary things for her. The king sighed heavily and said that because she didn't associate with people, no matter what he told her now, she wouldn't understand anything. He said that instead, he wanted to give her one piece of advice. The king said that she shouldn't abuse her power. He said that the power of her spirit was originally created to save people, the power with which long-awaited rain can be poured on long-dried lands. She said with fury that he kept insisting on care that she herself did not receive. He sighed heavily and said that he was not saying that revenge was bad. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. He said that most of all, he did not want to advise her to kill anyone, especially people she did not know. She sighed heavily and wondered why killing someone was bad. There are many people who kill others for completely different reasons. She knew that Irina and the king were all the same. She looked at the king intently and said angrily that she would repeat herself again, since she did not understand what he was talking about. The king sighed heavily. He came closer to her and asked if she wanted to try something different. The young lady froze in place as she saw his intense and angry gaze. With lightning speed, he grabbed her hand and she screamed in surprise. A moment later, she felt and saw a bright glow on her hand. A moment later, she heard her friend's voice. The young lady froze in shock as she saw that the king was holding her spirit in his hands. The young lady rushed to the king with rage and haste. She asked him what he was doing and also shouted for him to let her friend go. He looked at her intently and said that he did not like it at all, that she wanted to kill many people. The king looked at the princess intently and said that right now he was going to kill her spirit here and now. The young lady was in shock. She shouted at the king to calm down and not say such things. The king looked at her intently and said with a smile that, according to her logic, the one she had lived by until now, he was not doing anything bad at all. He looked at her with a grin and said that nothing could be done about the fact that the weak died at the hands of the strong. He looked at the princess intently and said that she could say goodbye in advance. Osiria was shocked as she did not expect this. The king looked at the princess intently and said that she would never see this child again. Aqua screamed in fear and called for her mistress. The princess froze in rage. She was shocked and didn't understand if he was really saying that Aqua was going to die in front of her. Everything went dark before her eyes. She wondered if she would never be able to see her friend again. Her heart was beating very hard. She collapsed to the ground. Osiria screamed that she would never let him do this. She screamed and asked the king not to torture her friend. Osiria knew that Aqua was her only family, the only piece of light in that terrible attic. She never stopped screaming that Aqua was her only one. The king looked at the young lady intently, not taking his eyes off her. He saw that she was not herself and was enveloped in magic. He looked at her hard and said that she was just a stupid girl. The king shouted at the young lady to come to her senses. She looked at the king with fury and contempt and shouted at him to let her friend go. The young lady was puzzled, and it seemed to her that everything was very strange, because everything was in front of her eyes, and everything was red. It seemed to her as if something was swelling inside and wanted to come out. She was in shock because she could not cope at all. The king, in turn, looked intently at the young lady who was trembling. He looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that this would not do. A moment later, he walked closer to her and used his magic on her. The young lady froze in shock as her vision returned to her. A moment later, she saw her friend rushing towards her. Aqua looked closely at her owner and asked if she was okay. The king looked closely at the princess and told her to come to her senses, as the spirit was not dead. The king sighed heavily and said that he had not hurt him at all. Aqua, in turn, confirmed the king's words. The young lady looked at her friend with tears in her eyes. Hugging her friend, the young lady pulled her towards her, and with a smile on her face, said that she was very glad. Osiris looked at her friend closely and said that she thought she had lost her forever. She didn't know what would happen to her if she lost her forever. The king looked at the princess intently and, sighing heavily, he said that he would not kill the spirit. Looking at the princess, he said that she could not worry and calm down. The king said that, however, he very much hoped that she would not forget the feeling that she had experienced a little earlier and would keep them within herself. He looked at her intently and said that the more of what was dear to her, the greater would be her torment from the revenge she was carrying out. She looked closely at the king, who was smiling as he looked at her, and noticed that he still had the same strange expression on his face. He looked at her with a smile and asked her if she liked his country. He asked her to say what she really felt. The young lady ethnologist frowned and said that his country was the opposite of an empire. It was full of abundance, and the people's faces were bright. She thought for a moment and said that she thought it was a good country to live in. He looked at the princess with a smile and asked how she liked his son. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that he was talking about the knight, Fidelius. The young lady looked at the king in bewilderment and asked in surprise if he was really his son. The king sighed heavily and said with a smile that it turned out that she didn't understand such jokes either. She sighed heavily and said sadly that the young man was stronger than anyone she had ever met. He also treated her like a person, and all the people around him were also kind. She said they were so kind that she thought good people would gather around a good person and be truthful. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really thought so. The young lady looked at the king in surprise and asked, "Isn't that so?" The king laughed for a moment and, looking at the young lady, said that if she had seen what the young man was like before, she would have been very shocked. She looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. The king looked at her intently and said that people change, and Fidelius and those persons from the estate that he found also change. He came closer to the princess and said with a smile that there are no initially good people. He smiled and said that he was not saying that her words today were wrong or bad. He looked closely at the princess and said with sadness in his voice that she had probably just found her path in life, as she knew how, and that was a very good thing. The young lady looked at the king with tears in her eyes. He smiled a soft smile and said that what she did not know could be learned, and what was wrong could easily be corrected. He smiled and said that he only wanted to tell the young woman in advance about the full weight of the burden she was about to take on. He smiled and said that for this reason she must look a lot, listen a lot, feel a lot, and grow. She looked at the king intently, as she was curious as to why, despite his obvious superiority and strength, he did nothing after she had done something dangerous. She was not afraid now, and she felt confident in her soul. She looked closely at his smile, and it reminded her of the smile of her mother who kissed her on the forehead. She looked at the king intently and asked in surprise who he really was. He smiled and said that he didn't even know how to answer that question. But for now, it could be said that he was just a man, cleaning up after his stupid friend. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that his joke had caused her pain, so as an apology, he would tell her something. He looked closely at the princess and said that how strong she became, how developed she became as a person, would be equal to the development of her spirit. He said the reason the baby still looked so small was because she had not been able to develop properly. The young lady looked at the king in surprise and asked if her friend had not grown up completely. He looked at her in surprise and said that spirits grow to the size of a human. He asked in surprise if she really thought that all God's blessing could do was make it rain and suck the moisture out of a person. She sighed heavily and said that was exactly what she thought. The king looked at the young lady with a soft and casual smile. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that he had not seen such a baby for a long time. She looked at him in bewilderment, since she did not understand what he was talking about. At the same time, the king looked at her with a gentle smile. A moment later, he stood up and said that their conversation was over. The king looked at her intently and said that if he got bored, he would call her again. He smiled and said that next time they could talk about something fun. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in shock. She wondered if he would suddenly kick her out, since she had a lot of questions. He looked at her intently and said that she needed to get to the parade ground. After a while, he began to tell her how to do it correctly. The king looked at the young lady and said that he would soon have a visitor, so she would disturb their conversation. But a moment later, the young lady was startled as someone burst into the king's study. She stood there in surprise, looking at the lady. The lady looked at the king with fury. She was burning with fire. She told the king that he had escaped so wonderfully yesterday. The king looked at the prime minister with a smile and said that he had not run away at all, but had gotten lost. He smiled and said that she had misunderstood him at all. She looked at him with fury and asked if his actions could be so misunderstood. The young lady in turn froze in place from the silk. She did not know what to do. Osiris looked at the Prime Minister intently. She was shocked and wondered who the young lady really was to scold the king so loudly. Elena looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really that princess from the Empire. She came closer to the princess, but she in turn shuddered and moved away. The princess was excited and wondered if she really knew her. With the speed of lightning, she shouted that she would go and ran away. Elena in turn shouted at the princess to give in because she wanted to talk to her. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that it was awkward for her to talk to the king whom she was afraid of. But that very king shaking in front of this woman, she was very scared and she did not want to talk to her. Aqua looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Osiria looked at her in bewilderment. Aqua looked intently at her mistress and said that she had been scolded. The young lady looked at Aqua in surprise and asked if she was the one who was scolded. She sighed heavily and said that now she understood what it meant. Maybe because she couldn't understand it properly, she felt nothing at all. But at the same time, she didn't feel like she had been convinced of anything. Osiria thought for a moment, as she had never seen a fortune teller make such a face before. She looked closely at her friend and said that it was time for them to return to Fidelius. The young man in turn sat and quietly drew. He was very excited. Some time later, a beautiful picture appeared before his eyes. He was very worried because he did not know if the princess was okay. For a moment he thought that he should have warned the king in advance about her strong timidity. He froze and shuddered as he had not noticed the man who had approached him. The young man looked closely at the painting and asked the captain who it was that was depicted in it. The captain was shocked as he was lost in his thoughts and did not notice the man. Taken aback, he looked at the knight and asked if they had finished their training yet. The young man said very loudly that they had already run 30 laps around the parade ground. The knight looked at the captain with a smile. He was curious about who the captain was drawing. He said that the young lady was probably beautiful. The knight looked at the captain intently. He was very glad that this had finally happened. Fidelius looked at the knight with bewilderment. A moment later, the knight looking at the captain shouted, "Did he really have someone with whom he started communicating?" The captain was shocked since the knight was shouting very loudly. A moment later, all the knights froze and looked intently at the captain. They could not believe what they heard. With lightning speed, all the knights ran to their captain. They wanted to know if it was true that he had a girlfriend. They wanted to know if it was true that the captain was getting married. Fidelius was shocked. The young man looked at all his knights and shouted at them to get away, as they were all sweaty. He shouted at them not to come near him. The knight looked at his captain with a smile and told him not to say such a thing, but rather to tell them everything. The knights shouted that the deputy was telling the truth, and they would like to know more about everything. Fidelius shouted angrily at them to leave immediately. He asked if 30 circles were not enough for them. A moment later, the young lady came closer to them and called out to Fidelius. Everyone looked at the princess in bewilderment. The young lady in turn froze looking at the young men as they stared at her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really just said that everyone should get out. The knights looked at the young lady in surprise, as she was beautiful. Fidelius instantly became embarrassed as he looked at the princess. Osiris winced and wondered if she had put him in an awkward position. She knew very well that she was a stupid princess from the Empire who remained in the kingdom as a hostage. She knew that her image in society was far from the best. She was taken aback for a moment, as she had not thought that he would be so uncomfortable. He ran up to the princess with lightning speed and called her. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she got here without an escort. She looked at him in surprise and said that she got here on her own. The young lady was very worried. She thought that she should have returned to the estate right away. She froze in shock, looking at everyone present, because she did not understand why they were muttering while looking at her. She saw their intent gazes and did not understand at all what was happening to them. She did not understand why they were looking at her so intently. The knight with a smile told his captain that the young lady was an exact copy of the girl from their picture, which he had just painted. Fidelius closed his subordinate's mouth with lightning speed, and he froze in shock. He looked at the young beautiful lady and said with a smile that it was nothing important. Osiris looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what was wrong with him. It seemed to her that he was hiding something from her. Another knight came up and looked closely at the princess. He asked with a smile if this was the princess who had come from the empire this time. They looked at her intently, as they wondered if this was the same princess that the captain had been looking after lately. They all looked at the captain and asked if he could introduce them to the princess. They said she was beautiful in the picture, but much more beautiful in life. The young man was taken aback and asked for a moment of silence. They asked the captain to tell everything as it was. The young lady in turn froze in place, as everything seemed very strange to her. She looked intently at the young people, as they did not seem evil to her. It seemed to her that everything was the other way around, since they all smelled like Mary, and a moment later she felt a gaze on her. The young man looked intently at the young lady and called her. He looked at her with a radiant smile and said that they were not afraid of her at all. The young lady in turn was very surprised as he frightened her. With the speed of lightning, she rushed into Fidelius's arms as she was very scared. She was taken aback and shouted at him to save her as she was very scared. The knights looked at their captain intently. They were in shock as they knew that he was her savior. The young captain looked at everyone present with fury and said that from this moment on, they would all have an extra 50 laps around the parade ground. The young people were shocked and could not believe what their captain said. They shouted to the captain that they had just finished training. He looked at them with fury and said that they had to start right now. The young lady froze in shock. She did not understand why she felt like she had done something bad. Fidelius and Osiria stood silently and watched as the knights ran extra laps. He looked at the princess intently and said that she must be tired. He apologized for that. He said that he had to stay here until they finished training. She looked at him with a smile and said that everything was fine. She really enjoyed watching it, and it was a lot of fun. The young man looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at all the knights intently, as she thought they were simply incredible, as not a single one gave up, and they all continued to run. She wondered if it was all because of the order the commander gave them. She looked closely at the young man, as she was impressed by his authority, and thought that he was simply incredible. He looked at her closely and threw it down, and if anything bad had happened, he asked, did not say, or something the king told her. The young lady in turn froze. She did not know what she should answer him yet. She thought for a moment how to explain everything to him. She looked at the young man intently and said that the king had told her that if she did not obey, he would kill her. The young man froze in shock. He looked at her intently and asked if she was really talking about His Majesty now. He asked if the king had said that he would kill her. She looked at him intently with a smile on her face. Osiria understood that to be more precise, he had threatened to kill not her, but Aqua. But a little earlier, she was really scared. Unfortunately, she could not understand a word of what the king was saying. She decided to turn a blind eye to this misunderstanding. She looked at her friend intently, and she did it in such a way that he did not react much to her words. She looked at him intently because she understood that everything was very obvious, and for him, the king was a man who could only be followed blindly. The knight approached the captain and said that they had just completed their training. He looked at him closely and said that it was very good and they could rest. The knight sighed heavily and sat down on the ground. They were very hot. One knight said that it was all because they trained more than usual. The knight sighed heavily and said that it would be very good if suddenly rain came upon them. The young lady was shocked to the spot. A moment later, a knight approached the young lady and greeted her with a smile. She froze in surprise, looking at him, and greeted the knight with a puzzled expression. The knight looked at the princess with a smile and said that he was the captain's deputy. He began to tell who he was and what his name was, but suddenly the captain pushed him away. The knight looked at the captain in surprise and asked why he was doing such things. The captain looked at the knight intently and calmly asked what he was doing. Fidelius wanted the knight to leave. The knight in turn wanted to talk to the princess, but the captain interfered with him. He shouted that the princess had accepted his greeting. He smiled and said his name was Kaulan. The captain was shocked as the knight still managed to introduce himself. He angrily attacked his assistant and told him to stop doing this. The young lady in turn laughed with a gentle smile. The captain froze in place as he heard her sincere laughter for the first time. Osiris, in turn, burst into laughter. She had never laughed like that before. The young people froze in place in embarrassment as they saw her beautiful and radiant smile. The young man looked intently at the princess and said that even when she laughed, she was incredibly beautiful. She had bad memories of knights in armor, but the people of this kingdom gave her a completely different feeling. A moment later, she froze in surprise on the spot as the knight knelt before her. He looked at her intently and, taking her hand, said that for the first time in his life, he had seen such a beautiful person. The young lady in turn froze in surprise and looked at him intently, but a moment later she called him again. He looked at her with a smile. She looked closely at the young knight and said that the captain was behind him. The knight froze in place. Fidelius looked closely at his subordinate and with a smirk said that it seemed like they hadn't crossed swords lately. The captain looked at his deputy and told him to immediately take out his weapon, and he would now check how much his abilities had improved. The young man was taken aback and said that he would manage. But a moment later, they were already fighting on the training ground. Everyone looked at the young people. They sighed heavily because they were very hot. They said that it was just terrible weather for training. The young lady in turn looked closely at everyone present, as it seemed that everyone was unbearably hot. She wondered if it was all because of the strong sun. The knight sighed heavily as he tasted the warm water, which had warmed up. Being in the hot sun, they knew that it was still ideal, when at such moments there was a refreshing rain. They looked closely at the sky as they saw that it was clear and there was not a cloud. The knight sighed heavily and said that it looked like this week hellish training would continue. They hoped that God would help them. After all, the young lady froze in place for a moment. The knight sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, with this weather, there would be no rain. The young lady watched everyone present closely. The young lady asked her friend if she could hear her. Aqua told her mistress that she could hear her perfectly well, and also asked what she needed. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if she could make it rain. In that place, a moment later, the young lady saw a bright light. Aqua told her mistress that if she wished she could do it. The young men took their turn and continued their training. A moment later, they froze and looked up in surprise as rain began to fall on them. The captain in turn froze in shock on the spot as he did not expect it to rain. The knights were glad that it started raining in such hot weather. They shouted that it had greatly refreshed them. The young lady, in turn, watching the knights intently in the distance. She froze in shock as she had never seen such magic. She slowly walked into the rain as it refreshed her. She heard the sound of rain, which was making her feel cold, and raindrops were running down her palm. She felt very fresh and pleasant. The young man approached the princess and called her. He looked at her intently and told her to come inside, as it seemed like the rain would stop soon. He said that they would return to the estate after it finished. The young lady looked at the young man intently as she felt strange feelings. She couldn't believe that the rain that the empire so badly desired could come so easily. The young people in turn rejoiced at the rain and thanked the heavens. The knight asked with a smile how his daughter could go at the very moment when he was so needed. He smiled and asked if he had the ability to breeze his rain. The young lady looked into the distance. It all seemed very strange to her, since for the first time in her life, she had seen people so happy about the rain. and after a while the captain covered her so that she would not get wet. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. He said that there were some healthy people present here, and she was probably very scared. He looked at her closely and said that he seemed to have shocked her in many ways. She looked at him intently and said that it was not so because she was not afraid, but very happy. He looked at her in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later, he fell down in rage and said that he was sure she was scared, and therefore next time he would make sure that they could not get close to her under any circumstances. A moment later, someone called her. She turned around and saw a knight looking at her with a smile. He smiled and said that she should remember him. The captain looked at the knight with fury. The young lady in turn stopped the captain from acting rashly. This was true, since she was not afraid. She understood perfectly well that she was not afraid now, since the captain himself was protecting her. It seemed to her that absolutely no one would harm her. Some time later, the young lady was resting in her bed. For a moment she thought about what had happened, because every time she met and talked to new people, she knew that none of them had hurt her. Now she understood everything. She knew that if her mother were alive, she might not have dreamed of the place. But a moment later, anger washed over her, as she remembered what they had done to her mother. She winced as she realized that unfortunately she had failed to protect her. Whenever she felt down, all she could do was look up at the sky no bigger than her palm. She ate moldy bread and was constantly beaten and insulted. Before her friend appeared, she thought that this was her whole world. Ever since her friend started telling her about what existed outside, things that interested her began to appear one after another. She dreamed of laying her body on a soft bed, or having a light conversation with friends while sitting on the lawn. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and told her to close her eyes. She had learned that interacting with someone could be very pleasant. When a young man hugged her with his whole body or warmed her with his heat, she felt very pleased. Sometimes, without even noticing it, she would close her eyes and imagine it. She was not locked in darkness until her tears were burned away. She fell asleep, finding herself in her mother's warm hives. Osiria sighed heavily because she knew that such thoughts were simply useless. She knew that the past could not be returned, and her mother could not be revived. She sighed heavily, knowing that she was too small to protect her. She knew that if she were like she was now, she would never allow her mother to die such a horrible death. She knew she was no longer the princess who was locked in the attic. She knew she only had to remember one thing. All she had to do now was take revenge for her mother. She looked at her friend closely and said that she wanted to check something. She asked her friend if she remembered a maid named Irina. Aqua thought for a moment and said that, of course, she remembered, since that was the person she first used her ability on. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was all true. She said that she had to see for herself the effectiveness of the curse and how it was progressing. She looked at her mistress and said that she had left her mark on her, and so they could meet her at any time if there was water nearby. Osiris looked at her friend closely and said that this was very good, and they would go right now. Aqua looked at her mistress in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Aqua was surprised and confused. She didn't understand what to do with the clever man. She asked the owner if they could just tie him up with magic. The young lady said that this should not be done, as she would try to convince him that she would sleep alone. She said that the king of this place would not allow anyone to harm him. She thought it was very funny because she couldn't believe that she now wanted to have both a family and a friend. She knew that she had to be patient for a little while, until the moment when she could make her wish come true. She knew that once that moment came, the cold feeling of emptiness would disappear too. He looked at her intently and said that he had made cards with words. Fidelia said he thought it would be a good idea to learn a little vocabulary before going to bed. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he behaved like that whenever she was busy with something. She was puzzled, as she knew all the words from the cards he brought her. He looked at her intently and said that they would not only speak, but also write letters. He said that as soon as she learned this, she would be able to write letters. She looked at him in surprise, He said with a smile that letters are text on paper that one wants to convey to another person. She frowned for a moment, as she did not understand why she would write something on paper and hand it to another person. She knew perfectly well that she had no one to send letters to. A moment later, she fell with a crash. She hit the table and said that she wanted to sleep. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was already going to sleep. The princess looked at him with a smile and said that she wanted to go to bed early today. She looked at him intently and told him not to follow her, as she would be sleeping alone tonight. He froze in surprise, looking at the princess, as she did not expect to hear something like that. He asked if she really wanted to sleep alone, and the princess said in all seriousness that she did. He stood for a moment and stared at the princess, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, he said that this could not be done, because it would be dangerous for her to sleep alone. The young lady knew perfectly well that he would say something like that to her, but she knew that she couldn't give in to him today. She wanted to see which of them would win. She looked at him intently and said that it was not at all dangerous for her to sleep alone. She shouted for him not to come. He looked at the princess for a moment, then said that if she slept alone, monsters might come at night and grab her. He said that if not monsters would come for her, then ghosts. The young lady froze in place from the silk. She looked at him intently and asked if that was really the case. The young man, in turn, looked away from the princess in embarrassment. She was shocked and wondered what he was even talking about. The princess came closer to the young man and, pulling him by the sleeve, asked if she could sleep just one night without him. The young man froze in place from embarrassment, but she understood perfectly well that she would not retreat, since she had an important matter. Fidelius looked closely at the princess and agreed. Aqua looked at the princess worriedly and asked if she was okay. She asked if they should go back home. The young lady, sighing heavily, said that everything was fine and that it was better than when she was riding in the carriage. She said there was no time for this and they needed to act. She looked closely at her friend and asked how they could find the place where Irina was. A moment later, the young lady heard some noise. She saw that the door was locked and asked her friend if she could open it. Aqua said that of course she would do everything. Now, a moment later, the door swung open, and young Lydia froze in place from shock. The maid crawled closer to the young lady and asked her to save her, as her throat was dry. She begged the young lady to give her one glass of water. The young lady looked at her with disdain and asked for one glass of water. Aqua said that she would do it now. The maid froze in place from shock. She could not answer anything. The princess looked at the maid intently and said that if she was left like this, she would die before she even reached dry land. Aqua said that everything would be fine since she was getting enough water to survive. A moment later, a puddle of water formed in front of the maid. The maid, in turn, began to greedily drink water from the floor. The princess looked at the maid intently and said that this was her reward. The maid looked at the princess in bewilderment. The princess said that although they always blamed her, she was not the bad one. She looked closely at the maid and said that it was not she who was bad. The maid was praying for salvation. The young lady looked at the maid intently and said that she did not want to do that, as she had only come today to check on her condition. The princess said that she shared water with her, so she cannot die until she arrives at the empire.